Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're getting into friendship stories, the ones about the people who knew you longest and hurt you in the ways that only people who know you longest can. The group chats that turned on you, the best friends who weren't, the slow discoveries that changed the shape of everything before them. Get comfortable and let's get into it. First up, someone who had a best friend of 11 years and discovered at the end of those 11 years that the friendship had been operating on a set of terms they had never been shown. My best friend's name was Naya, and we had met in the first week of college and had been, in every meaningful sense, each other's person for the decade that followed. The kind of friendship that functions as a second family. The person you call before you call anyone else. The person whose presence at significant moments you assume rather than invite. The person whose knowledge of you is so complete that you stop explaining context because the context is already shared. I had that with Nia for 11 years, and I believed, without examining the belief because it had never required examination, that she had the same thing with me. The discovery came from a source I did not expect, which was Nia herself, in a conversation that she initiated and that she had clearly been building toward for some time. She asked to meet for coffee on a Saturday in a way that had a quality of deliberateness I registered without interpreting. And I came to the coffee shop with no particular preparation and left it with a reorganized understanding of 11 years that took me the better part of a year to fully process. She told me she had been in therapy for the previous 18 months and that the therapy had surfaced something about our friendship that she had been sitting with and had decided I deserved to hear directly from her rather than through the ambient drift of increasing distance, which was the alternative she had been considering. I told her I was listening. She said the friendship had been, from her side, significantly more effortful than she believed I understood it to be. She said she had spent years managing a dynamic between us that she experienced as unequal, not in dramatic ways, not in ways that produced specific incidents she could point to, but in the accumulated texture of whose needs organized the friendship's attention, whose difficulties received the sustained engagement, whose life was more consistently the subject of the conversations we had. She said she had not told me because she had not known how, and because each individual instance of the imbalance was small enough to seem unworthy of a conversation, and because she loved me and had not wanted the conversation to damage something she valued. She said the therapy had helped her understand that the not telling had its own costs, and that continuing to manage the imbalance privately was not something she could sustain, and that she was not asking me to respond right now. She was telling me because I deserved the truth, and because she was trying to be someone who told the truth, even when it was hard. I sat with what she said for a long time at that coffee shop table. My first response was defensive in the way that first responses to this kind of information usually are. I went through the friendship in my memory, and I found counter evidence, and I assembled it into a case that I did not present to Nia, because I was aware, even in the defensiveness, that assembling a case against her account of her own experience was not the response the moment called for. I said I heard her. I said I needed time to think about what she had told me. She said she understood and that she was not going anywhere. The time I took was 3 weeks. The 3 weeks produced something I had not expected, which was that the counter evidence I had assembled in the first defensiveness did not hold up as well under sustained examination as it had in the immediate aftermath. I went through the friendship not looking for evidence against her account, but trying to see it from her side, which is a different kind of looking, and what I found was more consistent with what she had described than I had initially wanted to acknowledge. The imbalance was not as complete as her account might have suggested. There were years and periods where it ran differently, where she was the one whose life organized the attention, but the general direction she had described was real, and I had not seen it because I had been on the end of it that did not require seeing. we had a second conversation, this one longer and less composed than the first, with more of the ordinary difficulty of two people who are trying to be honest about something painful without losing what they're trying to preserve by being honest about it. I told her what my 3 weeks had produced. She received it with the specific quality of someone who had been waiting to be believed, and was now being believed, and was not entirely sure what to do with the relief of it. We talked for 4 hours. The friendship did not end. I want to be clear about that because the shape of the story might suggest a conclusion that did not occur. What ended was the version of the friendship that had been running on her management of an imbalance I had been too comfortable to notice. What replaced it was something more deliberately mutual, more examined, more conscious of the specific ways that attention in a friendship can become habitual rather than reciprocal. It required effort in the beginning and became easier over time, and is, 3 years after that Saturday coffee shop conversation, the most honest friendship I have. She gave me something by having that conversation that I have tried to extend to other relationships since, which is the specific willingness to say a true and difficult thing about a dynamic, rather than continue to manage it privately. That willingness is rarer than it should be. Most people choose the management. Nia chose the conversation. The choosing cost her something and produced something better than what it cost. That's where that one lands. The counter evidence assembled in the first defensiveness and then examined more honestly across 3 weeks is the psychological movement this story turns on. The narrator doing the work of sitting with an uncomfortable account long enough to find what is true in it, rather than stopping at the first available defense. Nia's framing of going to therapy and deciding the narrator deserved the truth is the framing of someone who has done the preparation that a conversation like that one requires, which is why the conversation was able to be received rather than simply deflected. The friendship surviving and becoming more honest is not the easy resolution it might seem. It required both people to do something hard, and the doing of it, rather than the surviving, is what the story is actually about. Sometimes the most generous thing a friend can do is tell you something about yourself that they have been managing quietly, because the managing protects the friendship in the short term and limits it permanently if it continues. This next one is from someone who was part of a friend group for 7 years and discovered that the group had a version of them that had been circulating inside it for years without their knowledge. The group had formed in our mid-20s around a shared workplace and had survived the individual departures from that workplace that happened across the years as people moved on to different jobs and different neighborhoods while maintaining the group as a social constant. There were 6 of us at the core and a rotating outer layer of partners and adjacent friends who came and went without changing the essential character of the group, which was warm and specific and organized around a shared history long enough to have accumulated its own mythology. The stories that got told at every gathering, the references that only landed inside the group, the specific texture of people who have known each other through enough that the knowing has a weight to it. I was, within the group, the one who was known for a particular quality that I had always understood as a positive one. I was direct. I said things other people were thinking but not saying. I raised the difficult subject when it was sitting in the room. I named dynamics when the naming was useful. This quality had been valued in my understanding of how the group worked, and I had operated with that understanding for 7 years, without examining whether the understanding was accurate or whether it was the understanding the group offered to my face while operating on a different one when I was not present. The operating on a different one was revealed to me through a conversation with one member of the group, a woman named Claire, who I had always been closest to within the 6, who told me something in month 8 of a difficult year that she had been sitting with for longer than that. She said she needed to tell me something because she thought I deserved to know, and because the not telling had become something she could no longer justify to herself. The group had a name for the quality I'd always understood as directness. The name was not directness. The name was something I'm not going to repeat, because the repeating is not necessary, and because what matters is not the specific word, but what the word indicated, which was that the quality I had experienced as valued had been experienced by most of the group for most of the 7 years, is something they managed around and debriefed about after gatherings at which I had been present. Claire said there was a version of me that circulated in the group in my absence that was unflattering in ways she had always found overstated, but that had accumulated enough agreement across enough years that it had become the group's settled understanding of who I was. She said she was telling me because she disagreed with the settled understanding, and because she thought the person being described was not the person she knew, and because she had watched the gap between the group's version of me and the actual version accumulate across years without being able to close it from the inside. And she had finally concluded that the only person who could address it was me, equipped with the information she was now giving me. I asked her why it had taken 7 years. She said each year the moment for telling had seemed worse than the year before, because more had accumulated, and the accumulated weight made the telling harder rather than easier, which is the specific trap of information that should have been shared early and wasn't, where the duration of the not sharing becomes its own obstacle to the sharing. I sat with what Claire told me for a long time before deciding what to do with it. The range of available responses was not simple. I could address it directly with the group, which would require me to disclose that Claire had told me, and would put Claire in a position she had not fully anticipated when she made the decision to tell me. I could address it indirectly by simply being present in the group with the awareness of what was circulating, which would change how I operated without requiring a confrontation. I could withdraw from the group, which was one available response to learning that the group had been carrying a version of you for 7 years that you were not aware of. I could do nothing, which was not actually available to me once I had the information. I chose the direct route, not a confrontation, a conversation with the group at a gathering where I said, without identifying Claire as the source of the information, my idea that I had become aware that my directness was experienced differently by some people than I had understood it to be, and that I was interested in an honest conversation about it if people were willing to have one. The quality of the silence that followed that statement told me Claire's account had been accurate. Then people started talking, and the conversation that happened was the most honest one the group had ever had, and it lasted until 2 in the morning, and produced something that the 7 years had not produced, which was an accurate mutual understanding of how everyone in the group experienced each other. 3 of the 6 are still close friends. The other 3 are people I see occasionally and regard with the complicated warmth of shared history that is no longer active. The version of me that had been circulating in the group did not survive the 2 in the morning conversation, which is the outcome Claire had hoped for when she told me, and which I have been grateful for in the years since. The gratitude travels back to her specifically. She did the hard thing at personal cost, and the cost produced something real. There it is. The gap between the quality as self-understood and the quality as received by the group is the specific injury in this story, and the 7 years of its accumulation is what makes it significant rather than the kind of misunderstanding that resolves in a single honest exchange early on. Claire's telling being the act that makes the resolution possible is the structural fact that the story keeps returning to. Without the information, there is no conversation. Without the conversation, the version keeps circulating, and the version keeps doing what versions of people do in group dynamics, which has become more fixed and less accurate the longer they go unexamined. Sometimes the most important thing a friend can do for you is tell you what is being said about you when you are not in the room, even when the telling is the hardest available option. Here's one from someone who had a group of friends navigate a significant falling out and found themselves, without intending to, positioned as the neutral party, and discovered what being the neutral party actually costs. The falling out was between two members of a 6-person group who had been the group's most consistent social engine for 4 years, and their names were Dom and Priya, and they had been close in the specific way of people who generate energy together. The gatherings they organized had a quality that the gatherings without them did not have. The group chat they animated ran differently on the days they were both present versus the days they were not. When their friendship fractured in the spring, it produced a disruption in the group's social ecosystem that affected everyone, which all of us had known it would, which was why the fracture had been the subject of anxious group conversation for the weeks before. It became a confirmed rather than anticipated event. The fracture was over, something I'm not going to detail, specifically because the details are not mine, and because the specifics matter less than the structure. What matters is that both Dom and Priya had legitimate grievances with the other, that both of those grievances were real and deserved to be taken seriously, and that both of them came to me in the days following the fracture, because I was, within the group, the person they both trusted most independently. I was Dom's friend first, from before the group, but had become equally close with Priya across the 4 years. My position in the group's social architecture was the position that made me the obvious recipient of both of their processing in the aftermath. I received both of them. I listened to Dom's account, and I listened to Priya's account, and I did not take sides because I did not believe taking sides was the right response to a situation where both people had been genuinely hurt by the other. I said true things to each of them about the other's perspective, and I said true things about what I observed in their own behavior that had contributed to the fracture, which is what people who trust you hope to hear from you when they are processing a significant rupture, and which is also what people who are in the acute pain of a significant rupture sometimes experience as a failure of loyalty rather than an act of care. Dom experienced it as a failure of loyalty, not immediately. In the first weeks, he seemed to receive my balanced engagement as the quality of a person who was trying to help, rather than the quality of a person who was choosing Priya's side. The shift happened at the 6-week mark when I said something honest about his role in the fracture that he had not been ready to hear, and that Priya had apparently said something similar about independently, and the similarity was interpreted by Dom as evidence of coordination, rather than as two people who knew him well, arriving independently at the same accurate observation. He told me he felt I had chosen Priya. I told him I had not chosen anyone, and that the observation I had made was one I had also made to Priya about her own contribution to the fracture. He said it did not feel that way. I said I understood it did not feel that way, and that I was telling him the accurate version, regardless of how it felt, and that the accurate version was that I was not able to tell him only what he wanted to hear because I was his friend and not his advocate, and that the distinction mattered. The distinction in the specific emotional climate of a fresh fracture was not a distinction Dom was able to hold at that point. We had several more conversations over the following month that reduced in warmth incrementally until the warmth ran out and the conversation stopped. The friendship with Dom did not recover in the way that the friendship with Priya did, which I have examined carefully enough to be reasonably confident was not a function of my having secretly chosen Priya, but was a function of Dom's and Priya's different capacities to hear honest things about themselves from a mutual friend in the context of a painful situation. What I lost in the neutral party position was not the friendship with Dom alone, though the loss of that was real. What I lost was the version of the group that had existed before the fracture, which required Dom's presence and my friendship with Dom to be what it had been, and that version did not survive. The group reorganized around the new configuration, and it was a good group in its new shape, and it was not the same group. The cost of being the neutral party In a group fracture, it's not obvious before you are in it. The obvious costs are the emotional ones, the labor of receiving two people's pain and processing simultaneously. The less obvious cost is the specific vulnerability of the neutral position in a situation where both parties are looking for confirmation of their own account, and the person who declines to provide it is experienced by both parties as providing the other ones, because that is how group fractures distribute their interpretations. Neutrality is not a protected position. It is a position that both sides read as the opposite of what it is, and the reading tends to be more durable than any clarification you can offer. And that's that. The observation that Dom and Priya had arrived at, independently being interpreted as coordination, is the specific mechanism of the group fracture's interpretive dynamics. The hurt party cannot receive the information that two people who know them well have independently noticed the same thing, because receiving it would require acknowledging what the two independent observations suggest, which is more than the hurt party is able to do at the acute stage. The narrator's distinction between friend and advocate is the right distinction, and also the one most likely to cost them in a context where advocacy is what is being asked for. Sometimes the most honest position in a group fracture is the most exposed one, and the exposure is the price of the honesty, rather than evidence that the honesty was wrong. Last story for this chunk. Someone who discovered that the person they had considered their closest friend had been sharing their private disclosures with a wider audience for years, in a way that only became visible when the audience revealed itself. I am a private person by inclination and by experience. I share things selectively and with intention, and the people I share with are people who have earned that level of trust through specific demonstrated behavior over time. My friend Sasha had earned that level of trust over 8 years, and I had shared with her accordingly. The real version of things, not the managed version, the kind of sharing that requires the specific safety of believing the other person is a closed container for what you give them. I discovered she was not a closed container through a mechanism that is simultaneously mundane and specific enough that the specificity is the thing that made it undeniable. I was at a gathering with people I knew less well than Sasha, and a woman I had met twice said something to me that contained information I had not given her. Not dramatic information, a detail about a situation I had described to Sasha 2 years earlier, offered by this woman in a context that assumed I remembered telling her, which I did not because I had not told her. I said something non-committal and moved through the party and went home and thought about the detail and where the woman could have received it. The answer was not complicated. The woman was in Sasha's closer social circle, and the detail was one that had traveled from my conversation with Sasha into that circle in the 2 years since I had shared it. I did not know how much had traveled or in what form, or what the motivation behind the sharing had been. I knew one data point, and I held it until I had more. The more arrived over the following months in the form of small accumulations, references from people in Sasha's orbit that assumed knowledge of my life I had not provided them, the occasional quality of being known about in contexts where I had not introduced myself, the specific social texture of someone whose private disclosures have been circulating in a world they are also moving through. Each instance was individually explainable through coincidence or through the ordinary, ambient information sharing that happens in overlapping social circles. Together, they were not coincidence. I told Sasha what I had found over 8 months of accumulation. I gave her the specific instances, the woman at the party, the others I had noted, the pattern they assembled into. She did not deny it with the clean confidence of someone being falsely accused. She was quiet in a way that had its own information, and then she said she sometimes shared things in conversation without thinking carefully enough about the source, and that the sharing came from a place of closeness rather than carelessness. She talked about me because I was important to her, and talking about people who are important to you is a thing people do without always tracking the audience carefully enough. I told her I believed the closeness was real, and that the closeness did not resolve the specific problem, which was that my private disclosures had been offered to me as a close container and had not been treated as one. She said she understood and she was sorry and she would be more careful. I said I appreciated that and also that the careful I was asking for was not a more careful version of the same practice, but the stopping of the practice, because more careful sharing of someone's private disclosures is still the sharing of someone's private disclosures. We negotiated what came next, not explicitly, through the implicit recalibration that happens when a friendship survives a significant discovery, and both people are trying to find the shape of what comes after it. I shared less with Sasha, which was not a punishment or a strategic decision, but the natural consequence of having received information about how my disclosures were being handled. She shared more with me, which I noticed and interpreted as an attempt at reciprocity, and also as evidence that the friendship was still trying. We arrived somewhere that was not what we had been, and was functional and was honest about what it was. The 8 years before the discovery were not retroactively spoiled by it, which I want to say because the retroactive spoiling impulse is real, and I had to resist it. The friendship had been real. The sharing had been real. The problem was also real, and the problem did not make the realness false. It made it complicated, and complicated is not the same as fraudulent, even when the distinction is uncomfortable to maintain. There it is. The known about quality in social contexts where you have not introduced yourself is one of the more disorienting experiences a person can have in a social world, and the narrator names it with precision. Not a single dramatic incident, but the accumulated texture of private information circulating in public space. Sasha's framing of sharing as an expression of closeness is the framing that most people who do this use, and it is not entirely wrong, and also does not address the actual problem, which is consent rather than intention. The narrator's response, not more careful sharing, but stopping the practice, is the right line to draw, and the hardest one to maintain because it requires the other person to change something that feels natural to them, rather than simply being more attentive about a habit they plan to continue. The retroactive spoiling resistance is the most mature thing in the story and the hardest one. This one is from someone who spent 6 years in a friend group and discovered that the group had been making significant decisions about its own membership and direction in a side channel that they had never been invited into. The group was 7 people who had formed around a shared interest in their late 20s and had maintained the formation across the years through a combination of regular gatherings, a group chat, and the specific inertia of shared history that keeps groups together past the point where the original organizing interest would have been sufficient on its own. I was the 6th person to join, brought in by a member named Sol, who I had known separately and who had introduced me as someone the group would like. They had liked me, or had appeared to, and I'd been part of the group for 6 years before I found out about the other channel. I found out through an accident that was so ordinary, it still strikes me as appropriate. The most significant revelations tend to arrive through the most mundane mechanisms. Saul was showing me something on their phone and navigated past a conversation thread that I caught in the peripheral vision of a glance, rather than a direct look. In the thread had the group's name with a word after it I had not seen before. The word after it indicated it was a version of the group that did not include everyone. I did not say anything in the moment. I noted it and sat with it. I found the channel through my own accounts the following evening. I had been added to it at some point and had never noticed because it had been inactive during the period I was checking, which I now understood was not a coincidence. The archive was accessible, and I read it with the specific quality of someone reading something they had not been meant to read, while also having every right to read it, because it was addressed to them in a channel they had been added to. The channel had been running for 4 years, not continuously, in bursts. I'm organized around specific situations in the main group that the subset was processing privately. The subset was 4 of the 7, the 4 who had been in the group longest, and the processing they had been doing in the channel included discussions of the 3 newer members, myself included, that had a character I had not known to expect. Not uniformly negative. Some of it was warm, but the warmth existed alongside a sustained and private negotiation of the group's direction and membership that had been happening beneath the surface of the group I had believed I was part of. And the negotiation had produced decisions about the group that had been presented to the full group as collective, rather than as the output of a 4-person deliberation that 3 of the 7 had not been invited into. I read the archive across 2 evenings. My entry appeared in it with a frequency and in a context that told me I had been a subject of deliberation in ways that had not been visible in the full group. Nothing catastrophic, no planning of my removal, or significant hostility, but assessments of my behavior and contributions that had been made privately and had informed how the 4 members interacted with me without my knowledge, which is a different kind of being known than the kind you consent to. I spoke to Sewell, who was into the subset and who had been the person who brought me into the group. I told Sewell what I had found, and I asked them to tell me, honestly, what the channel was for and what my appearance in it meant. Day. Sewell was quiet for a long time, and then said the channel had started as a way for the founding members to coordinate without the complexity of the full group, and had become something more than that without anyone fully deciding. It should become something more. Sewell said they were sorry I had found it this way, and sorrier that it existed in the form it did. I asked Sewell what I was supposed to do with the fact that 4 people had been deliberating about my place in a group I had believed I was an equal member of across 4 years of my membership. Sewell said there was not a clean answer to that, and I said I knew that, and I was asking anyway. And Sewell said they thought the honest answer was that the founding members had never fully transferred the group's governance to the full membership, and that the channel was the evidence of that, and that the evidence was real, and the thing it evidenced was a problem that Sewell had not known how to raise internally. I did not leave the group immediately. I sat with what I had found for several weeks, and I thought about the 6 years and what they had been, and what they now looked like with the channel's existence as part of the picture. The 6 years had been real, the friendships, the gatherings, the accumulated history. The channel did not make the 6 years false. It made them a different shape than I had understood, with a layer of governance I had not known was there, and that had been shaping the group's decisions in ways I had been receiving as collective without knowing they were curated. I had a conversation with the full group in which I disclosed what I had found without positioning it as an accusation, and without performing a neutrality I did not feel. I said what I had found and what it had produced in me, and I gave the group the space to respond. The responses were varied in ways that told me the 4 founding members and the 3 newer members had been experiencing the group differently across the entire 6 years, and that the channel's existence had not been a surprise to the people who already knew about it, and was a significant surprise to the people who did not. The group did not survive the conversation intact, and 2 of the founding members withdrew in the weeks after. The remaining 5 continued in a form that was smaller and more honest about what it was, without the channel and without the layer of private governance that the channel had housed. I am still part of the remaining 5. It is a different group. It is a group I know the shape of, which is something I did not have for 6 of the years I was in it, and which I find, even at the smaller size, to be worth the reduction. That's the full picture. The archive being accessible because the narrator had been added to the channel is the specific detail that makes this story's discovery feel structurally appropriate rather than violative. They were not snooping, they were reading a record that had been addressed to them and then apparently forgotten. The 4-year private deliberation about group membership and direction being presented to the full group as collective decision-making is the actual harm, not the assessment of the narrator specifically, but the systematic removal of 3 members' participation in the governance of something they were told they were equal members of. The remaining 5 being smaller and more honest about its shape is the right conclusion, not the restoration of what was there before, which was never fully what it appeared to be, but something new that knows what it is. The next story is from someone who had a friendship of 9 years in a way that was so quiet and so gradual that they spent 2 years not being sure the friendship had ended at all. His name was Marcus, and we had been friends since the 2nd year of our respective careers. In meeting through an industry overlap that had produced a genuine connection rather than the purely professional acquaintance that such overlaps usually produce. We were the kind of friends who talked about things that mattered rather than things that were easy. The conversations had a depth that I had not found commonly in adult male friendship, and that I had valued for that specific rarity. 9 years of that kind of conversation build something that feels substantial and durable, and I had not examined whether it was because the examining had never seemed necessary. The drift began in year 7 in ways that were individually attributable to ordinary life circumstances. He had a child in year 7, and the child reorganized his available time and attention in ways that were entirely expected, and that I accommodated without resentment because the accommodation was what the situation required. The contact reduced to the level appropriate to someone navigating early parenthood, and I held it there and waited for the natural restoration that usually follows the acute phase. The restoration did not come at the pace I had expected. Year 8 produced a contact level that was modestly higher than year 7, but that remained below the baseline of the first 6 years, by enough to register as a change rather than a temporary adjustment. I told myself the new baseline was the new baseline, that adult friendships shift with life circumstances, and that the shift was not a signal about the friendship's value, but about the competing demands on his time and attention. Year 9 was when I understood that what I'd been calling accommodation or an adjustment was actually the managed acceptance of a distance that had a direction I had not named. The contact in year 9 was below year 8. When we did talk, the conversations had a quality that was different from the first 6 years. Present, warm, but slightly above the surface, in a way that produced the texture of people who are catching up, rather than people who are continuing something ongoing. The depth that had been the friendship's particular quality had reduced to something more occasional and less assumed. I raised it once. Not as a confrontation, as an observation, offered in the tone of someone who is checking in, rather than lodging a complaint. I said I felt like we had been less connected than we used to be, and I asked if everything was okay with him. He said yes, everything was good. He was just in a busy period. I said I understood. The busy period continued for the remaining 18 months of the friendship's active phase, through year 9 and into the beginning of year 10, at which point the contact reduced below the threshold that constitutes friendship in any active sense. And we arrived at the state that I spent 2 years not being sure was what it was. What made the not being sure last 2 years was the absence of an ending. There was no conversation, no conflict, no declared conclusion. The friendship tapered in the specific way of something whose energy has been withdrawn gradually enough that the withdrawal is never the subject of a direct accounting. I sent messages that were responded to with warmth and brevity. I initiated suggestions that were received positively and not followed through on. The warmth was always present, and the warmth was always the thing that prevented me from naming what the warmth was accompanying, which was an absence that the warmth was covering rather than filling. I named it to a mutual friend in year 11, and the mutual friend's response contained information I had not had, which was that Marcus had said something to them, about the friendship that indicated his experience of its ending was not as unclear as mine had been. He had not said it was over. He had said something about growing apart and about friendships serving their time, and about people being right for each other at particular phases. The mutual friend reported this with the careful quality of someone delivering information they know is going to land with weight. I called Marcus and I told him what the mutual friend had said, and I asked him to tell me directly what his experience of the friendship's current state was. The conversation that followed was the most honest one we had in years, more honest than the catching up conversations of year 8 and 9, more honest even than the depth conversations of the first 6 years, because it was honest about something difficult, rather than honest in the safe direction of shared intellectual engagement. He said the friendship had shifted for him in a way that had been difficult to articulate, and that he had been managing the shift through reduction rather than conversation because the conversation felt too large to have cleanly. I told him I understood the too large quality of it and that I had been sitting in the ambiguity the reduction had produced for 2 years, and that the ambiguity had its own cost that I wanted him to know about. He said he was sorry for the ambiguity. He said he had valued the friendship and still did, and that the shift was not about me, specifically, but about a version of himself that had changed in ways the friendship's established terms had not fully accommodated. I said I heard that, and that I wished I had heard it earlier, from him, and rather than from a mutual friend, and then from him in response to what the mutual friend had said. We are not close now. The conversation produced a clarity that the 2 years of ambiguity had not, and the clarity was not the restoration of the friendship, but the honest acknowledgement of its changed state, which is less comfortable than ambiguity in some ways and more workable in others. I know what the friendship is now. It is occasional and warm and without the depth that made it particular. I hold it at that scale without requiring it to be something it has already shown me it is not. There it is, the warmth always present and always covering. Rather than filling the absence is the most precise description of how a friendship's slow ending feels from inside it. Not coldness, not conflict, but just the specific texture of warmth that has been separated from the substance that used to accompany it. The 2 years of ambiguity being produced by the absence of a declared ending is the structural thing this story is about, and Marcus's management of the shift, through reduction rather than conversation, is named correctly as the thing that produced the ambiguity, rather than the shift itself. The shift was real and reasonable. The method of its communication was the thing that cost the narrator 2 years of not knowing what they were inside. Here's one that starts with a betrayal and ends somewhere more complicated. From someone whose best friend of 12 years told a secret that changed several things and whose telling turned out to have a context that changed the narrator's understanding of the telling. The secret was significant. I'm not going to describe it specifically because its content is not the point, and because it belongs to a period of my life that I share on my own terms, and not as material for illustrating a dynamic. What I will say is that it was the kind of thing I had shared with one person specifically, and had not shared more widely, because the sharing more widely had consequences I was not ready to navigate, and the one person I had shared it with was my friend of 12 years whose name was Danny. Donnie told someone, not the general world, a specific person, a mutual acquaintance whose relationship to the information was complicated in ways I had not anticipated, and that produced ripples I had to navigate before I had been given the chance to navigate them on my own terms. I found out that Danny had told this person through the specific mechanism of the person referencing the information in a context that assumed I had been the one to share it, and the assumption's inaccuracy was the tell. I called Danny. The call had the quality of a call where both parties know what the call is about before a word has been said. She confirmed that she had told the person. She said she was sorry. She gave me a reason that I received as insufficient and that I told her was insufficient, and we ended the call without the repair that the call might have produced if I had been less hurt and if she had been more prepared. I did not speak to Dani for 3 months. 3 months is long enough to harden something into a conclusion, and I was in the process of hardening it into one when her mother called me. Her mother called me because Dani's mother had always been a person in my life, rather than purely the parent of my friend, which is the specific texture of a 12-year friendship. The other people in your friend's life become people in your own. She did not call about the secret or the falling out. She called because Dani had been going through something that her mother had decided I should know about. Dani had been going through it when she told the person my secret. Not as a justification. I want to be careful about this framing because the sequence of events does not constitute a justification. A person's difficult circumstances do not license them to share someone else's private information. But as context, she had been in a specific kind of trouble, and the person she had told my secret to was someone who had been able to help with the trouble in a way that had required establishing a basis of trust, and the establishing of that basis had involved sharing something that demonstrated the depth of the relationship she was vouching for. She had used my secret as a credential for her own trustworthiness in a situation where she had needed someone to trust her urgently. I sat with this for a long time. The sitting produced not absolution. What she had done had consequences for me that her circumstances did not erase, but a more complete picture of the thing I had been inside for 3 months. The picture had a dimension I had not known about, and the dimension changed what the thing was without making it not a thing. I called Dani. The conversation that followed was different from the first one. Longer, more complete, with both of us bringing the full version of events, rather than the partial versions the first call had contained. She told me about what she had been going through. I told her about what the 3 months had cost me. We held both things in the same conversation without letting either one cancel the other, which was the hardest and most necessary part of what the conversation required. The friendship survived. Not without a scar. There is a scar, a specific place where the trust was tested and did not hold perfectly, and was rebuilt from a position of greater knowledge rather than restored to its prior state. The rebuilt version is different from the pre-disclosure version and is, I think, more honest about the specific conditions under which trust operates between two people who are navigating their own difficult things and are not always able to be what the other person needs them to be. The honesty is harder than the prior innocence and more durable than it would have been if the disclosure had not happened. And that's where that one lands. The secret used as a credential for someone else's trustworthiness is the detail that makes the betrayal both worse and more human simultaneously. Worse because it was deliberate and purposeful rather than careless. More human because it was done under pressure, in service of a real need, rather than from indifference to the narrator's interests. And the context arriving from Dani's mother, rather than from Dani, is the structural detail that produced the reconsideration. Dani did not offer it as a defense, which would have felt like excuse-making. It arrived through someone who had decided the narrator deserved the full picture. The friendship surviving with a scar rather than being restored is the right ending because it is the honest one. Some breaches of trust are survivable, and they are survivable in a changed form rather than an unchanged one. And the changed form is what honesty between people who have hurt each other and remained produces. And this one is from someone who was part of a close friend group through their 20s and discovered at 34 that the story of how the group had formed, a story they had been telling for a decade, was missing a significant piece that one member had never added. The group was 5 people who had met in various configurations across 2 years of overlapping social circumstances, and who had solidified into a consistent formation by year 3. The story of how we had all found each other was one of those group mythologies. that gets told at gatherings and refined through retelling. The specific sequence of connections and coincidences that had assembled this particular 5 people into this particular configuration. I had told that story many times. I knew it as well as I knew any story about my own life. And the member who had never added her piece was a woman named Ren, who had been part of the group from the beginning, and whose version of how she had joined had always been the version she offered. That she had met one of the other members, Celia, at an event, and Celia had introduced her to the rest of us over the following weeks. This was the version of Ren's entry that I had held for a decade. It was accurate as far as it went. The part it did not include was that Ren had known about me specifically before she met Celia. She had known about me because she and I had had a mutual connection. Someone from a previous period of my life, whose relationship to me had been complicated, and whose relationship to Ren I had not known about. This mutual connection had described me to Ren in terms that were not neutral, in the context of a falling out I had had with this person years before the group formed. Ren had entered the group with a preformed understanding of who I was that had been shaped by someone who had reason to present me unfavorably. I found this out through the mutual connection themselves, who had reached out after years of silence with a message that contained, among other things, a reference to Ren that made it clear the connection was known to them. The reference was incidental. It was not the purpose of the message. But it was specific enough that I asked a direct question and received a direct answer that assembled the picture I had not had. I asked Ren about it in person, not with accusation in the framing, with the specific quality of someone who has found a missing piece and is asking the person who had it to help them understand what the piece means. Ren's response was the most honest I had encountered in any of the conversations this discovery produced. She said yes, she had known about me before we met, and yes, the knowing had shaped her initial perception of me. And no, she had not told me, because the initial perception had been revised so quickly and so completely by the actual experience of knowing me that she had concluded the prior account was not worth introducing as a complication to something that was working well. I asked her what the prior account had contained. She told me with a specificity that I found both uncomfortable and clarifying. Uncomfortable because hearing someone describe the unflattering version of yourself that circulated somewhere in your past is always uncomfortable. Clarifying because the specific things she described were recognizable as the version of me that had existed in the context of the complicated relationship, rather than as the version of me that had existed outside it. The unflattering account was not false in the way that fabrications are false. It was partial and motivated in the way of accounts produced by people who are no longer in a position of goodwill toward their subject. I told Ren that I wished she had told me earlier, not because the earlier telling would have changed anything about the friendship, which had been real and was still real, but because I had been operating for a decade inside a group dynamic that had a layer I had not known about. There was a version of how the group had formed that included the prior account and Ren's revision of it, and the decade of friendship that the revision had been tested against and confirmed. And that version was more complete and more interesting and more honest than the version I had been telling. I had been denied the complete version, not through malice, but through Ren's calculation, that the incomplete version served the friendship better, which was a calculation made on my behalf without my participation. She said she understood and that in retrospect she wished she had told me earlier too. The friendship absorbed the disclosure and continued, which I had expected because the friendship had a decade of evidence behind it that was more substantial than any single revelation about its origins could destabilize. The group mythology got a new chapter, the one that was always missing, and that makes the whole story more accurate, and therefore more worth telling. That's where that one ends. Ren's revision of the prior account happening so quickly that she decided not to introduce it as a complication is the most generous available interpretation of the non-disclosure and the narrator gives it that credit, before also noting that the calculation was made on their behalf, without their participation, which is the specific problem regardless of the motivation. The prior account being partial and motivated rather than fabricated is the distinction that keeps this from being a story about malice. It is a story about the specific way that other people's accounts of us travel into rooms we have not entered and shape the expectations of people we have not yet met. The group mythology getting its missing chapter is the right ending, not a rupture, just a completion. The story becoming more accurate and therefore more worth telling. This one is from someone who was part of a friend group for 8 years and discovered that a conflict they had believed was resolved had never actually been resolved. It had been tabled, and the table had been accumulating for the entire 8 years. The conflict had happened in year 2, and it was between me and a member of the group named Felix, and it had involved something I had said at a gathering that had landed badly. Not maliciously intended, but careless in a way that had caused genuine hurt, and that I had, when it was raised with me, apologized for directly and specifically. Felix had received the apology and said the matter was resolved, and the group had moved forward, and I had held the resolution as real for the 6 years that followed, because nothing in Felix's behavior toward me had suggested otherwise. He was warm. He engaged with me the same way he engaged with other members of the group. If there was a residue, I did not detect it. The residue revealed itself in year 8 through a conversation I was not part of, but that was reported to me by a member of the group named Sol, who had decided, after some deliberation, that I deserved to know what the conversation had contained. The conversation had been between Felix and 2 other members of the group, and had involved Felix describing, in detail and with the accumulated emotional weight of 6 years of private retention, the full scope of what my careless comment in year 2 had cost him and what he had continued to feel about it across the 6 years since the nominal resolution. The description had produced a conversation about me among 3 members of my friend group that had been organized around a version of the year 2 incident that had never been closed on Felix's side, and that I had been given no indication was still open. Sol told me because Sol thought I deserved to know, and because Sol was uncomfortable being in possession of information about me that I did not have about myself. I received the information with the specific quality of someone reconstructing a 6-year period in light of new data. Not dramatically, not with the acute quality of fresh betrayal, but with the slower disorientation of understanding that something you had believed was in the past had been present the entire time in a form you could not see. I asked Sol what the conversation had produced in terms of how the other 2 members of the group now understood the year 2 incident. Sol said the conversation had moved both of them in the direction of Felix's account, Inidao's, which was more complete and more emotionally textured than the account they had previously had, because the previous account had been the resolved version, rather than the version Felix had been carrying. I was aware, sitting with this, that 3 members of my 8-year friend group had been given a more complete account of a significant moment in the group's history than I had been given, from the person at the center of it, without my participation or knowledge. I asked to meet with Felix. He agreed with the quality of someone who had known this meeting was eventually possible, and had not arranged for it to happen sooner. We met, and I told him that I had heard about the conversation, and that I wanted to hear his account directly, rather than through the filter of what Sol had reported, he told me, where his account was fuller and more painful than the year 2 apology exchange had suggested. And I listened to it without the defensiveness that the year 2 version might have produced, because I had 6 years of evidence that the hurt was real. 6 years during which he had been warm to my face and carrying something privately that I had not been given the opportunity to know about or address. I told him I was sorry. Not the same apology as year 2, a more complete one, informed by the fuller account and by the specific regret of understanding that the year 2 apology had been accepted on terms that had not reflected the actual state of things. I told him I wished he had told me at any point across the 6 years that the resolution was not what it had appeared to be, because I would have wanted to know and would have wanted the opportunity to address it more completely than the year 2 exchange had allowed. He said he had not known how to tell me. He said the year 2 resolution had been genuine in his intention at the time and had become something different as time passed, and the hurt had not reduced in the way he had expected it to, and that each subsequent year, the gap between the official resolution and his actual experience had been wider and harder to bridge. I said I understood the widening gap, and that it was the gap I was most sorry about. Not just the original careless comment, but the 6 years of private carrying that my not knowing had made possible. We arrived at something more genuine than the year 2 resolution had been. The group has continued in a shape that carries the conversation, rather than the silence that preceded it. Felix and I are not the warmest members of each other's lives, but we are honest about where we are, which is more than the 8 years of managed warmth had been. That's the full picture. The 6 years of private retention being the actual harm rather than the original careless comment is the thing this story keeps returning to. Not because the original comment was not real, but because the resolution's falseness was what produced the accumulation, and the accumulation was what produced the 3-person conversation about the narrator in their absence. The narrator's more complete apology, being informed by the fuller account, is the right structural response. You cannot apologize accurately for something you have not fully understood. And the year 2 apology was accurate to the year 2 understanding, which was incomplete. Sometimes the most consequential thing in a friendship is not the thing that caused the hurt, but the resolution that failed to resolve it. Because the false resolution is what removes the opportunity to do the actual repair. Up next is someone who discovered that a friend they had known for a decade had been carrying a resentment so specific and so long held that its eventual expression reorganized everything that had preceded it. Her name was Mira, and we had been friends since graduate school, which is the specific crucible of friendship that produces either bonds that outlast most life circumstances or bonds that were always primarily about the shared crucible and cannot survive its absence. Ours had survived its absence. We had finished our programs and gone to different cities, and maintained the friendship through the distance, with the sustained effort that sustained adult friendships require, and that I had always attributed to the friendship's genuine value, rather than to inertia. The resentment had its origin in the final year of the program. I had been offered an opportunity during that year that Mira had also been considered for, and I had accepted the opportunity, and she had not been selected, and the sequence had a professional significance that I had understood at the time as significant and had believed we had navigated together in a way that was honest and mutual. She had congratulated me. I had been appropriately humble about the good fortune involved. We had talked about her own path and the directions available to her, and the conversation had the quality of two people who are real enough with each other to name a hard thing without being destroyed by it. 10 years later, Mira told me, in a conversation that was in all other respects an ordinary dinner, something that the ordinary dinner clearly had not been organized around, but that surfaced in the middle of it with the quality of something that had been looking for an exit and found one. And she said she had spent 10 years being happy for me, and that the being happy for me had required more active effort than I probably understood, and that she was telling me this not to take back the happiness, but to finally say something true about what the happiness had been built on top of. What it had been built on top of was a specific and considered belief that the opportunity selection 10 years ago had not been entirely fair, that my selection over her had been influenced by factors that had nothing to do with the merits of our respective qualifications, and that she had known this at the time and had chosen not to say it, because saying it would have required making a claim she could not fully prove, and that would have damaged a friendship she valued more than the grievance warranted. She had chosen the friendship over the grievance, and the choosing had not dissolved the grievance. It had just moved it somewhere private where it had continued to be what it was for 10 years. I sat with what she had told me across the dinner and across the days that followed. The claim about the selection's fairness was not one I could evaluate with certainty. I had not controlled the selection, had not been in a position to influence it, and did not know what had shaped it beyond what was visible to both of us at the time. What I could evaluate was the 10 years and what they looked like in light of what she had told me. The happiness she had extended across those years was not, in her own account, the happiness of someone who had made peace with the outcome. It was the happiness of someone performing peace with the outcome because the alternative was a conversation she had decided cost too much. I told her I was glad she had finally said it. Not because I could resolve the 10-year-old question of what had driven the selection, which I could not, but because the 10 years of performed happiness had been received by me as real happiness, and the receiving of it as real had prevented me from knowing what I was actually in. She said she understood, and that the not knowing was on her rather than on me, which I believed, and which did not fully account for what the not knowing had cost me in terms of the accuracy of my own understanding of our friendship. The friendship continues in a form that is more honest about its own weight. The 10-year question is not resolved. It cannot be resolved from the information available. And we have both agreed, explicitly, that the question is one we are going to hold without requiring resolution, which is uncomfortable, and which is the accurate way to hold something that cannot be made more comfortable without being made less accurate. I would rather have the discomfort and the accuracy than the comfort of the previous 10 years, which I now know was a different kind of discomfort worn as ease. And that's that. And the choosing of the friendship over the grievance producing not the dissolution of the grievance, but its relocation to somewhere private, is the central mechanism of this story, and the reason it took 10 years rather than 10 months. The private location was maintained specifically because Mira had decided the friendship was worth more than the expression, and the decision had the unintended consequence of making the friendship false in a direction that Mira could see, and the narrator could not. The narrator's response, glad she finally said it, alongside the honest accounting of what the not knowing had cost, is the both things true response that the situation requires, rather than the single register response that would be easier to deliver. And this one is from someone who spent 7 years in a close friendship, and discovered that the friend had been using the friendship as a kind of professional networking operation, without ever describing it in those terms. I want to be careful about how I frame this, because the reality of it is more nuanced than the summary suggests, and I think the nuance is the most honest part. My friend's name was Dominic, and he worked in an industry adjacent to mine, and the friendship had developed across the years through a combination of genuine compatibility and professional proximity. We got along well, and we moved in overlapping circles, and the combination had produced something that felt like genuine friendship, and that I believed was genuine friendship. And that was also, it turned out, serving a purpose for Dominic that he had not described to me, and that I had not known to ask about. I found out through the accumulation of small observations across the back half of the friendship's 7 years, rather than through a single revelation. Dominic had a way of introducing me at gatherings that emphasized my professional role and connections in a way that was slightly more pointed than ordinary context setting. He referenced our friendship in professional conversations in a way that I was occasionally told about by mutual professional acquaintances who had encountered the referencing, which was friendly, but which had a quality of professional credentialing that the friendship itself had not been organized around from my side. He brought me to events with a frequency and in a context that I had read as enjoying my company, and that I began to read with enough instances as something also about the company that being seen with me produced in certain rooms. I raised it with him directly in year 6 with a specificity I had developed through the accumulation. I told him I had noticed a pattern in how he used the friendship in professional contexts, and I asked him to tell me honestly how he thought about the relationship between the friendship and the professional proximity. The question was direct enough that it required a direct answer, and he gave me one that was more honest than I had expected. He said the friendship was real. He said this first, and I believed him, and that the professional dimension of it was also real, and had always been a component he had not seen as needing separate acknowledgement, because he had not thought of professional benefit as something that required disclosure in the context of a genuine friendship. I said I understood that framing, and that the framing had a logic, and that the logic did not address the specific thing I was raising, which was not the existence of professional benefit, but the absence of acknowledgement of it. The friendship had been presented to me, and I had experienced it as a thing organized around genuine compatibility. The professional component had been running alongside it in a way that I had not been given the opportunity to know about and evaluate. The not knowing had not been dramatic in its consequences. Nothing had gone wrong. Nothing had been taken from me. But it had meant I was inside something with a dimension I had not consented to and could not account for. Dominic received this with the genuine seriousness that his better qualities made available. He said he had not thought of the professional dimension as something that required consent because he had not experienced it as something he was doing to the friendship. He had experienced it as a natural expression of valuing someone enough to want to be associated with them. I said I understood the experience and that the experience did not resolve the consent question, and that the consent question was the one I was holding, and we arrived at something that was more honest than what we had had, an explicit acknowledgement of the friendship's multiple dimensions, and an agreement that the dimensions would be visible, rather than one of them running underneath the other without naming. The friendship in this more explicit form has been less comfortable and more functional, which is not a trait I had specifically sought, and which I have come to appreciate as better than the alternative of continued comfort, built on a partial account of what the thing is. There it is, the professional credentialing running alongside the genuine friendship, rather than instead of it, is what makes this story resist the simpler shape of a purely transactional relationship. Dominic was not performing friendship for professional gain. He was having a genuine friendship that also served a professional purpose. And the serving of the professional purpose without acknowledgement is the thing that needed to be named, rather than the friendship's reality being questioned. The consent question, being the one the narrator holds, is the right framing. Not was the friendship real, but was I inside the full version of what the friendship was? And the answer to the second question does not depend on the answer to the first. Here's one from someone whose friend group experienced a rupture so complete that within 6 months of the event that caused it, the 7-person group had become 3 separate configurations that no longer spoke to each other. The event was a party. I want to say that plainly because I think the ordinariness of the catalyst is the most important contextual fact. Not a betrayal, not a crisis, not a significant harm. A party that went wrong in the specific way that parties in close friend groups sometimes go wrong, which is that a combination of alcohol and accumulated tension and the specific social pressure of a significant gathering produced a series of exchanges that surface things that had been beneath the surface of the group for years, and that the surface had been managing without resolving. The exchanges happened between 3 members of the group, Lena, Tom, and Kara, and involved things that had been building for 2 years that I had been partially aware of, and had interpreted as minor and self-resolving. Yet, what I had not understood was that my interpretation was available to me, because I was not one of the 3 people the things had been building between, and the 3 people they had been building between had a different reading of the minor and self-resolving assessment that they had not shared with the rest of the group, because the group's stability had felt worth protecting. The night of the party, I witnessed enough of the exchanges to understand their general shape, without understanding their specific content, which I filled in over the following week through conversations with various members of the group who were each processing what had happened from their particular angle of it. The processing conversations gave me 5 different accounts of the same evening, each accurate from the perspective of the person giving it, and collectively producing a picture that was larger and more complicated than any single account contained. The group did not recover, not because the rupture was irreparable in principle, but because the rupture had revealed a set of underlying tensions that the group's social architecture had been managing for years, and that the management of which had required each member to maintain a version of relationships that was not fully accurate. When the management broke down at the party, the underlying tensions did not resolve. They became visible, which is different from resolving, and the visibility produced a series of individual responses that pushed the group's components apart rather than drawing them together. I spent 3 months trying to be a bridging presence among the emerging configurations, which is a role I took on without being asked and that I should have examined more carefully before taking on. The bridging was exhausting in the specific way that bridging always is when the things you are trying to bridge have decided they do not want to be bridged. And the exhaustion was compounded by the specific problem of bridging positions without being fully in any of them, which meant I was receiving everyone's processing without having a configuration of my own to process from. I stopped bridging in month 4. Not dramatically, I simply became less available for the role and let the configurations settle into whatever shape they were going to settle into without my assistance. The shape they settled into was 3 groups of varying sizes with varying levels of contact with each other, of which I was firmly in one and loosely affiliated with another, and no longer in contact with the third. What I have thought about since is not the party or the rupture specifically, but the 2 years before it, the period during which the group had been managing the underlying tensions that the party eventually surfaced. The management had produced a group that looked functional and felt warm, and that was doing more structural work beneath its surface than any of us had been asked to acknowledge. The party was not the cause of the group's ending. The party was the event that revealed the ending had been in progress for 2 years, and that the management had been what was keeping it invisible. That's where that one lands. In the 5 different accurate accounts of the same evening is the image that captures the specific epistemology of a group fracture most precisely. Each person's account is true from where they were standing, and the full picture is the sum of all of them, which is a sum nobody is in a position to see clearly, because everyone is inside one of the accounts. The narrator stopping the bridging role in month 4, rather than month 1 or month 10, is the specific timing that makes the self-examination credible. They tried the role, sustained it long enough to understand it, and stopped when the understanding arrived. The party as the revelation of an ending that had been in progress for 2 years, rather than the cause of the ending, is the structural insight that makes this more than a story about a bad night. This one is from someone who had a best friend for 13 years and discovered, through a single overheard conversation, that the person they had called their closest friend had a name for what the friendship was that the narrator had never been told. I want to be specific about the word overheard because it matters for how the information arrived and what it cost to receive. I was not eavesdropping. I was in a room that I had not announced my presence in because I had arrived quietly and my friend had not heard me come in, and was on a phone call that she had not known I would be present for. She was talking to someone I did not know, and the call was already in progress, and I caught enough of it before I made my presence known to understand that the conversation was about me. The name she used was not cruel. I want to say that because the story could be received as a story about cruelty, and it is not. The name she used was a phrase that communicated something about the friendship's function in her life that was not the function I had understood it to have. The phrase suggested that I was, in her understanding of the relationship, a person she maintained contact with, out of a specific kind of obligation. Not obligation in the legal or formal sense, but the specific obligation of long history and shared context that makes certain relationships feel like furniture rather than choice, necessary, without being actively wanted. I made my presence known. She ended the call. The conversation that followed was one of the more difficult I have had because it required both of us to hold something in the same room that one of us had not intended the other to have access to. I told her what I had heard. She did not deny it, and she did not immediately try to reframe it. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said she was sorry I had heard it, and that the conversation had not represented the full picture of what she felt. I asked her what the full picture was. She gave me a version that had more warmth in it than the overheard phrase had suggested, and that also, in its warmth, confirmed the essential truth of the phrase. That the friendship had a quality of habitual continuation to it, that was not identical to the act of choosing that I had understood it to be. She said she loved me. She said the 13 years were real. She said the phrase had been a shorthand for something she had not examined carefully enough, and that the examination was one she owed me and owed herself. I went home and I sat with what I had heard and what she had said, and I tried to do the honest version of what she had described. The examination I owed myself. What I found in the examination was that the overheard phrase had landed with the specific force that things land with when they name something you have been feeling without being able to articulate. The friendship had had a quality in recent years that I had not been able to locate precisely. A slight automaticity, a warmth that felt more habitual than intentional. And the phrase named that quality with an accuracy that the warmth of her subsequent explanation had not erased. I called her a week later, and I told her what the examination had produced. I told her the phrase had named something real, and that I had been feeling the thing it named, without having the language for it, and that I was not certain the problem was hers alone, that I had been participating in the habitual version of the friendship, without examining whether it was still the version either of us was choosing actively. She was quiet in the way of someone receiving something unexpected that is also, on reflection, accurate. We decided to examine it together, not a formal process, a commitment to being honest about whether the friendship was something we were actively choosing rather than habitually continuing, and to having that conversation periodically rather than allowing the automaticity to make the question unnecessary. The friendship into this examined form is different from the 13-year, unexamined version, and is, I think, more genuinely chosen, which means the choosing is something we can both take some credit for, rather than something that is simply happening to us by virtue of shared history. The overheard call is the event I return to most often when I think about that period. Not with anger. The phrase was not malicious, and the conversation was not designed for me to hear. With a specific gratitude, complicated by how it arrived, for information that changed the quality of a significant relationship by making it conscious rather than automatic. Consciousness is not comfortable, but it is the precondition for actual choice. An actual choice is what I had thought I was in, and what I now know I am in. That's where that one lands. And the phrase landing with the force of something that names what has been felt without language is the most precise description of why the overheard call was more significant than a simple miscommunication. It did not create a problem. It named one that had been present and unexamined. The narrator's honesty about their own participation in the automaticity is the thing that moves the story from a grievance into something more genuinely shared. They were inside the habitual friendship from their side as much as she was from hers, and the examination they commit to is a mutual one rather than a correction of her behavior. The friendship being more genuinely chosen in its examined form is not a comfortable resolution, but it is a real one. And the next story is from someone who was the last person in their friend group to find out that the group had collectively decided something significant about the narrator's life, and had decided it without telling them. The something significant was a belief, held by the majority of the group, that the narrator's relationship at the time was not a good one. not abusive. I want to be clear about the nature of the concern, which was not a safety concern, but a compatibility concern. The specific belief of people who know you well that the person you are with is not the right person for you in ways that they can see from the outside and that you cannot see from the inside. The belief had been forming across the 8 months of the relationship and had been discussed among the group members without being raised with me, because the group had collectively decided that raising it was not their place. The collective decision not to raise it had produced a collective silence that I was moving through without knowing I was in it. The gatherings during those 8 months had a quality I'd attributed to ordinary social dynamics, and that I now understand was the specific social management of a group that is holding something significant back from one of its members in the interest of that member's autonomy. I had been protected from my friend's concerns about my relationship for 8 months, and the protection had felt like ordinary friendship. I found out when the relationship ended, not because anyone rushed to tell me now that telling was safe, because a member of the group, a woman named Asha, he mentioned something in the aftermath of the ending that revealed she had not been surprised by it. The not surprise had a texture that I asked about directly, and she told me, more completely than she had intended to, about the group's 8 months of held concern. I asked her why no one had told me. She gave me the answer the group had collectively arrived at, which was that my relationship was my choice, and that the concern did not rise to the level that would justify interfering with a choice that was mine to make. I said I understood that position, and I also said that the specific result of it was that I had navigated 8 months of a relationship that was not right for me without the information that people who knew me well had already arrived at conclusions about it. That I said I might have arrived at my own conclusions faster with that information, or I might not have. But the not having had removed the option. Asha said the group had been trying to respect my autonomy. I said I appreciated the intention, and that autonomy and information are not opposites. That having my friend's honest perspective on my relationship would not have removed my ability to make my own choice about it. It would have given me more to make the choice with. She said she had made that argument in the group at the time and had been into the minority position. I told her I was glad she had made it. The more difficult part of the discovery was not the 8 months of silence. Those were over, and the relationship they had been maintaining silence about was over. The more difficult part was the understanding that the group had a capacity for collective management of information about me that I had not known it had. The protective silence had been well-intentioned and had also been a form of group decision-making about my life that had happened without me. I did not know what else had been subject to this kind of management, and I was not sure how to ask. I raised it with the group, collectively, rather than individually. I said I had found out about the 8 months of concern, and I was not angry about the concern, and I was raising the process rather than the conclusion. I said I would rather have my friends' honest perspectives on my life as they were forming than after the fact, even when the perspectives were ones I might not want to hear, because the having of them in real time was more useful than the having of them retrospectively. The group received this in various ways, some members immediately and some after time to think about it. And what came out the other side of the conversation was a more explicit, shared understanding of what honest friendship between us meant in terms of when to say difficult things and when to hold them. The relationship in question I do not think about much now. The group dynamic that the relationship revealed, I think about often because it was more significant than the relationship and more relevant to my ongoing life. The 8 months of held concern were not the last time the group faced a situation where honest speech was in tension with protective silence. And the conversation we had after my discovery was the thing that changed how we navigated the tension. Not perfectly, but more honestly than before. There it is. Asha having made the counter-argument in the group at the time and having been into the minority, is the detail that makes the group's decision feel less like a unified position and more like the kind of contested collective conclusion that groups actually produce. Somebody said the right thing and was outvoted. The narrator's framing of autonomy and information as non-opposites is the most useful conceptual move in the story, and the one that needed to be said to the group directly, because the group had been operating on the assumption that withholding their concern was the same as respecting the narrator's right to choose, which is not the same thing at all. The 8 months of held concern being less significant than the discovery of the group's capacity for it is the right ordering of what actually mattered. Here's one from someone who discovered at the end of a 7-year friendship that the person they had trusted most had been the source of a persistent and damaging piece of misinformation about them that had been circulating in their social world for most of those 7 years. The misinformation was specific, a version of something that had happened in my life several years before the friendship with Kara began, a period that had been difficult and that I had navigated with varying degrees of success, and that I had, in the context of the friendship, described honestly to Kara, because honest self-disclosure was the register the friendship ran on. Neither the version of that period that had been circulating in the social world we shared was not the version I had described to Kara. It was a version that was distorted in a specific direction, toward a reading of my behavior during that period that made my difficulties look like character failures rather than circumstantial ones. I found out because someone I had recently met said something that could only have come from the distorted version. Not confrontationally, they said it with the ease of someone relaying established fact, which is how distorted versions sound when they have been circulating long enough to acquire the texture of common knowledge. I asked them where they had heard the version they had just described. The chain of attribution, which they provided without resistance, led back to Kara. I went through the previous 7 years of my social world, and I identified, in retrospect, a set of instances that I had attributed to ordinary misunderstanding or to the natural distortion that information undergoes as it travels. The instances reassembled, once I had the attribution, into a pattern with a consistent direction, the direction of the distorted version, originating from the same source, traveling into rooms I had subsequently entered with a distorted version already there waiting for me. I confronted Kara with what I had found, not in the heat of initial discovery. I gave myself 2 weeks before the conversation, which was the time I needed to be certain I was presenting accurate information rather than a hypothesis, and to be certain I could have the conversation without the conversation being primarily about my anger rather than about what I had found. Kara's response was the most complicated part of the whole situation. She did not deny the sharing. She denied the distortion. She said she had shared the version of events as she understood it, and that her understanding was the version I had given her. I said the version she had apparently shared was not the version I had given her. She said she might have communicated it imperfectly as it traveled through her memory and through conversations. I said imperfect communication across 7 years in a consistent direction was a specific kind of imperfection. The conversation did not resolve in a satisfying way, because the evidence for deliberate distortion versus genuine misremembering was not definitive from the outside. I believed the distortion was deliberate. I cannot prove it was deliberate. What I can say is that the pattern was specific enough and directional enough that the charitable explanation required a level of sustained accidental misrepresentation that I could not hold with confidence, and that the uncharitable explanation was more consistent with the evidence, even though the evidence was not conclusive. The friendship ended, not in a dramatic scene, in the specific quiet of someone who has decided that the uncertainty about what a person is capable of is itself sufficient reason to change the terms of a relationship, even in the absence of proof. I did not need certainty to know that the friendship could not continue as it had been. I needed certainty for the conversation, and I had enough for that. The rest I held is the irreducible uncertainty of a situation that does not admit of a clean verdict. What I have carried from it is something about the specific vulnerability of honest self-disclosure to the person you most trust. The disclosure is necessary for genuine friendship, and the necessity makes the vulnerability unavoidable. You cannot protect yourself from the risk without also protecting yourself from the thing the risk makes possible, which is being genuinely known by another person. I have not become less willing to be known. I have become more attentive to how what I disclose is received and reflected back, which is a different kind of attention from suspicion, and which I have found possible to maintain without the friendship-destroying vigilance that suspicion would require. And that's that, the distorted version, having the texture of common knowledge when the person the narrator has just met repeats. It is the detail that captures the specific harm most precisely. Not a rumor circulating messily and visibly, but a version that has been in the world long enough to have acquired the settled authority of established fact, which is harder to correct and harder to trace. Kara's response, not denying the sharing, but denying the distortion, is the response that occupies the most uncomfortable territory, because it is neither a confession nor a clean refutation, and the narrator's reading of it as more consistent with the uncharitable explanation than the charitable one is the kind of judgment call that honest people make when they have assembled enough evidence to have a position without having enough to be certain. This one comes from someone who was in a close friend group for 10 years and discovered at year 10 that the story of how a significant falling out within the group had been resolved was not the story of what had actually happened. The falling out had occurred in year 4 between two members of the group, a man named Joel and a woman named Bex, and had been significant enough to threaten the group's existence for a period of several months before an apparent resolution had been reached that allowed the group to continue. I had been involved in the resolution as one of the members who had spoken to both Joel and Bex during the months of difficulty and had encouraged both of them toward the conversation that had publicly concluded the matter. The resolution had held across 6 years of subsequent group life, and I had held it as a genuine resolution, as evidence that close friendships can survive significant ruptures when the people involved are willing to do the work. At year 10, Joel told me something that he had been carrying since year 4, and that he said he was telling me now, because the friendship between us had developed to a point where carrying it had become more costly than saying it. He told me the year 4 resolution had been performed rather than genuine on his side, that he had agreed to the conclusion of the conflict, not because the conflict had actually been resolved, but because the social pressure of the group's distress about the conflict had been more than he was able to continue sustaining, and that the performance of resolution had been the path of least resistance, rather than an accurate representation of where he was. I asked him where he had been in year 4 that the resolution had not captured. He told me. The telling took a long time and produced a picture of 6 years of group life that had a different shape than the one I had been inside. He had been present at every gathering, warm in the ways that the group's warmth required, to participating into the mythology and the rituals and the accumulated history of a 10-year group, all of it organized around a performance of resolution that had been running since year 4, and that had cost him something every year it continued. I asked him why he had not said something sooner. He said the same thing people in this situation always say, which is that each year the cost of saying it had seemed to exceed the cost of continuing the performance until it no longer did. I said I understood the calculus, and I also told him that the 6 years of his performance had affected my experience of the group in a way I was now recalibrating in real time, that I had believed I was inside a group that had done something genuinely difficult and come through it, and that the belief had been part of how I understood what the group was and what friendship could do, and that the belief was now more complicated than it had been an hour ago. He said he was sorry for that. I believe he was. I also believe that the sorry did not fully account for 6 years of the group being shaped by a resolution that was not real, because the sorry was being offered now rather than during the 6 years. And the during was when the accounting would have mattered most. The group has continued past the conversation. Joel and Bex have now had the conversation that year 4 never produced, which year 10 made possible in a way that year 4 had not been. Because by year 10, the social pressure that had produced the false resolution was no longer the dominant force, and both of them had enough distance from the original rupture to be able to see it clearly, rather than through the acute lens of the conflict itself. The conversation they had produced something that the year 4 resolution had been supposed to produce, and had not, and the group they are part of now is more honest about what it survived and what it is still surviving than the group I thought I was part of. For 6 years, I do not feel betrayed by Joel. I want to say that clearly because the story could be received as a betrayal story, and I do not experience it that way. I experience it as a story about the specific cost of performing resolution in a social environment that needs the resolution to be real, and about what that cost produces for the person performing and for the people receiving the performance. And the cost is real in both directions. The receiving of a performance as genuine is its own kind of investment, and the investment produces something, a belief in what friendship can do, that the discovery of the performance complicates rather than destroys. There it is. Joel's performance of resolution being maintained across 6 years, by the same calculus that produced it, each year the cost of saying it exceeding the cost of continuing, is the mechanism that explains the duration, without requiring malice as its engine. The narrator's honest accounting of what the belief in the resolution had meant for them, the investment in what friendship can do, is the most specific thing the story offers, because it names what was actually lost in the discovery, which was not the friendship itself, but a particular piece of evidence the narrator had been holding about friendship's capacity. The distinction between not feeling betrayed and recognizing the cost is the nuance that makes this narrator credible. This one is from someone who spent 5 years in a friendship that felt like the most honest relationship of their adult life, and discovered at the end of those 5 years that the honesty had been directional, flowing primarily from them toward the other person, and not equally in return. My friend's name was Theo, and the friendship had developed in our early 30s, in the specific way that adult friendships sometimes develop when two people find each other at a point in their lives, when they are both actively trying to understand themselves better. We were both in therapy, both in the middle of the kind of self-examination that the 30s sometimes produce, and the friendship had a quality of genuine mutual inquiry that I had not found in many adult friendships and had valued for its rarity. We talked about real things. We were honest about our failures and our fears, and the specific ways our histories had shaped us in directions we were trying to understand and adjust. The conversations had a depth that I associated with genuine intimacy, and that I believed was built on an equal foundation of mutual disclosure. The discovery that the foundation was not entirely equal arrived not through a dramatic incident, but through a gradual accumulation of moments in year 5, where I became aware, one at a time, that pieces of information I had shared with Theo had traveled to people I had not shared them with, while equivalent information that Theo had apparently shared with me had not traveled anywhere, because I had held it the way I believed you hold what a friend trusts you with. The asymmetry became visible most clearly at a gathering in year 5, where a person I barely knew said something to me that could only have come from Theo. Not something damaging, something private. The category of private rather than the content is what matters here, because the content was not the injury and the sharing of the category was. I had told Theo things that were mine to decide who knew. Theo had apparently decided who else knew, which was a decision that had been mine rather than his. I sat with this for several weeks before I spoke to Theo about it because I wanted to be sure of what I was observing before I said it. The several weeks produced more instances rather than fewer, as awareness of the pattern made the instances more visible in retrospect and in the ongoing present. By the time I spoke to Theo, I had a specific and documented understanding of what I was describing rather than a general feeling that something was wrong. Theo received my account with the quality of someone who had known a version of this conversation was possible and had hoped it would not arrive. He acknowledged the sharing. He said it came from a place of closeness, that he talked about me because I was important to him, that the sharing was an expression of how much the friendship meant, rather than a disregard for its terms. I said I believed the closeness was genuine, and that the closeness did not resolve the specific problem, which was that I had understood the friendship to have a particular level of discretion, and had been operating on that understanding while the actual level was different. The directional asymmetry was the part that I found most difficult to articulate and most necessary to name. I had been holding Theo's disclosures with the care I would have wanted mine held. He had not been holding mine with equivalent care. The friendship had been running on two different sets of assumptions about what it required from each of us. And the discrepancy had been invisible to me, because my side of it was consistent with what I had presented to him as the terms of the friendship, and his side was not. He said he had not thought about the directional quality of it, and he said it with the genuine quality of someone who is encountering a dimension of their own behavior that they have not previously examined, which I believed, and which was both reassuring and frustrating simultaneously. Reassuring because it confirmed the absence of deliberate harm. Frustrating because 5 years of unexamined asymmetry is a long time for something to go unexamined. We arrived at a conversation about what the friendship needed going forward. He committed to more discretion. I committed to being direct if I noticed the pattern continuing, rather than accumulating evidence privately for months before raising it. We tested both commitments across the subsequent year and found that the commitments held with imperfect consistency, and that the imperfect consistency was something we were able to name and adjust in real time, rather than in the delayed way of year 5's conversation. What I hold from the 5 years before the conversation is not a revised version of the friendship, but the friendship with a more complete picture of how it worked. The depth was real. The inquiry was mutual. The discretion was not mutual. And knowing that changes how I experience some of the depth, not removing it, but adding a layer to it that was not previously visible. I have decided the layer does not make the depth false. It makes it more honest than it was when I did not know. The layer existed, and that's where that one ends. The directional asymmetry is the concept that names the specific injury most precisely, not a betrayal in the dramatic sense, not a single act of disclosure that can be pointed to and addressed, but a structural difference in how two people were treating the same friendship's requirements that had been invisible because one person's treatment was consistent with the stated terms and the other's was not. Theo's genuine surprise at the directional framing is what the narrator reads correctly as both reassuring and frustrating, because it confirms the absence of intention, while also confirming 5 years of unexamined practice, which is a different kind of problem, and one that required a different kind of response. The next story is from someone who was part of a group of 6 friends through their 20s, and discovered at 31 that 2 members of the group had been in a romantic relationship for most of the decade, and had collectively decided not to tell the rest of the group. I want to let that sit for a moment before I continue. 2 members of a 6-person friend group were in a relationship for most of a decade. The other 4 members of that friend group did not know. The relationship had been kept from the group by mutual decision, and with a consistency that required both parties to manage a significant deception across hundreds of group gatherings, shared holidays, and the ordinary social occasions that a close friend group produces across 10 years. Their names were Sam and Petra, and they had been, from my perspective and from the perspective of the other three group members, two people who were close friends with a slight edge of something unspoken that I had attributed to the specific chemistry that some friendships have, without being able to name it more precisely. The something unspoken was, I now understood, the specific management of a secret rather than the specific texture of a particular friendship. And the texture I had been reading as chemistry was the texture of two people who were in something together that they were not showing the people around them. I found out through Petra, who told me on a Thursday evening at a dinner that was just the two of us, and who told me with the quality of someone who had been deciding to tell someone for a long time, and had finally arrived at the point where the decision made itself. She said she and Sam had been together for 9 years. She said the group did not know. She said she was telling me because she was tired of the not telling, and because I was the person in the group she trusted most, and because she thought I deserved to know before the rest of the group knew, which would happen soon because they had decided to stop hiding it. I asked her the question I most needed to ask, which was why, not as an accusation, as a genuine inquiry. Because the 9 years, and the 6 people, and the hundreds of occasions required an explanation that I could not assemble on my own. She said the beginning had been during a period when the relationship was uncertain enough that disclosure felt premature. She said the uncertain period had ended, and the relationship had become the most significant one of her adult life. And, by the time it had become that, the group had years of assumption built into it. That changing the assumption felt like it required more than either of them knew how to do. She said each year the disclosure had seemed harder than the year before, because more had accumulated around the assumption, and the accumulated weight had been its own obstacle to the simple truth that the relationship had become. She said she was sorry. She said it in the specific way of someone who has been carrying an apology for a long time and is finally giving it to the person they owe it to, which is different from the way apologies sound when they are offered quickly in the aftermath of something. I received it as the thing it was rather than the thing a quicker apology would have been. And the disclosure to the full group happened 2 weeks after my dinner with Petra. The group's response was varied in ways that I had anticipated, and in ways that I had not. The response I had anticipated was surprise. Everyone was surprised, including me in the full group context, even though I had had 2 weeks to adjust. The response I had not anticipated was a specific kind of hurt from 2 group members who had, at various points in the 9 years, had genuine romantic interest in one or the other of Sam and Petra, and who had managed that interest in the context of a group dynamic that had not contained the information that would have been most relevant to their management of it. The group did not fracture. It reorganized around the new information in the way that groups sometimes do when a significant revision of their shared history arrives all at once, with the specific work of adjusting 9 years of memory through the lens of something that changes the texture of what was remembered without changing the events themselves. The memories were the same, the context of them was different. The adjustment required was the adjustment of context rather than event, which is in some ways harder than the adjustment of event, because context does not have a specific moment to point to. Sam and Petra are still together. The group is still together, in a smaller and more reconfigured form. I am still closer to Petra than to most of the others, which is the legacy of the Thursday dinner and what it produced between us. A conversation that cost her something, and that I received with the honesty she had decided I was capable of. The 9 years of not telling I do not fully understand even now. I understand the mechanism, the accumulation, the widening gap, the weight of what had not been said, making each subsequent moment of potential, saying harder rather than easier. What I do not fully understand is how 9 years felt. From the inside, like the right answer to a question that a much earlier conversation would have resolved. I have asked Petra this directly. Her answer is that it never felt like the right answer, only like the less wrong one than the available alternatives year after year, until the years ran out. There it is. The texture of something unspoken, being read by the narrator as friendship chemistry, rather than secret management, is the detail that shows how complete and sustained the performance was. Not a transparent concealment, but one thorough enough to produce a misreading that was in the same direction as the reality without touching it. The two group members who had managed genuine romantic interest in the context of a dynamic that did not contain the most relevant information are the specific secondary harm that the story contains, and that most retellings of this kind of revelation would not include, which is what makes this narrator's account fuller than the simpler version. The image Petra gives at the end, not the right answer, only the less wrong one, year after year, and until the years ran out, is the most honest description of how sustained deceptions are maintained by people who are not primarily deceivers, which is the most human and therefore most recognizable part of the whole thing. This one is from someone who had a close friend who was, for 6 years, the person they called first with good news, and who discovered at the end of the 6 years that the good news calls had been received in a way that was entirely different from how they had been made. Her name was Jess, and I had known her since university, and the friendship had one of those qualities that some long friendships develop, which is an almost unconscious mutual attunement, the ability to call each other at the right moment, to know when the other person needed something without being told, to be present in the specific way that someone's actual history with you makes possible rather than the general way of someone simply trying to be a good friend. I trusted the attunement. It was the thing about the friendship I valued most. The calls with good news I had made across 6 years were the ordinary calls of someone sharing the significant moments of their adult life with the person they were closest to. A job I was excited about, a relationship that was going well, an achievement that mattered to me. I made these calls with the specific openness of someone who believes the person on the other end is genuinely happy for them. Because Jess had always sounded genuinely happy for me, and I had received the sound as the thing it sounded like. It. The discovery arrived through a mutual friend named Clara, who told me something she had apparently been deciding about for months. Clara said that Jess had, in various conversations with her across the 6 years, expressed a feeling about my good news that was different from the feeling Jess expressed when receiving it from me. The feeling Jess had expressed to Clara was not straightforward happiness. It was a more complicated feeling that involved, alongside the genuine affection for me, a strand of something that sat alongside the affection uncomfortably, and that Jess had been processing with Clara, rather than acknowledging to me. Clara described it carefully because she was a careful person and because she understood the weight of what she was telling me. She said it was not resentment exactly. She did not want to use a word that was stronger than what she had observed. She said it was more like a difficulty with being consistently on the receiving end of other people's good fortune when her own life was going through periods that were harder than she had disclosed to me. She said Jess had always come through for me on the calls, had always managed to be present and warm in the way the calls required, and that the management had been effortful in a way I had not known about, and that had cost Jess something across the 6 years that Jess had never shared with me. I sat with what Clara had told me, and I tried to understand what it changed about the 6 years, and about the friendship, and about what I owed and was owed in response to the information. What I arrived at, after significant sitting, was a picture more complicated than either the friendship I had believed I was in, or the simpler version of betrayal that the information might have produced in someone with a different disposition toward it. Jess had not been performing happiness with calculated dishonesty. She had been managing a genuine difficulty in real time in the moment of the calls. and the management had been an act of love rather than an act of deception. She had given me what the calls required because she loved me enough to give it even when the giving was hard. What she had not done was tell me the giving was hard, and the not telling had produced, across 6 years, a friendship I understood as more reciprocally easy than it was, and had denied me the opportunity to be for Jess what she had been for me in those calls. The person who shows up even when showing up is difficult. I would have wanted to know. I would have wanted the chance to ask how she was before I started sharing the good news, to hold both things in the same call, to be the kind of friend to her that she had been to me. I spoke to Jess about it. I told her what Claire had told me, and I did not position it as an accusation because it was not an accusation. It was an invitation for the conversation that the 6 years had not produced. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said she had not wanted to make my good moments about her hard ones, which was the specific logic of her not telling, and which I understood completely, and which I also told her I wished I had not governed the decision across 6 years. We talked for a long time that night, about her life and the hard periods, and what they had been, and what she had been carrying while showing up for my calls. The conversation was one of the closest we have ever had, and it arrived through the specific door of a disclosure that had been avoided for 6 years, which is the specific irony of information that is held to protect a friendship, and that turns out to be the thing the friendship needed most. That's the full picture. Jess's management of genuine difficulty in the moment of the calls being an act of love rather than deception is the reframe that changes the whole story's moral character. This is not a story about a friend who was secretly hostile. It is a story about a friend who was protecting the narrator's moments at cost to herself across 6 years, which is a different kind of problem and requires a different kind of response. The thing the narrator wishes for, the chance to have asked how Jess was before sharing the good news, is the specific and practical form that the missed intimacy takes, which is more useful than a general lament about the friendship's incompleteness. Sometimes the people who show up most consistently for your good moments are the ones most in need of someone to ask about their hard ones. And this one is from someone who had a best friend of 8 years betray them in the most specific and personal way available, by telling the story of the worst period of the narrator's life, in detail, at a gathering where the narrator was present and did not know they were about to become the subject. I want to describe the specific quality of that kind of exposure before I describe the circumstances, because the specific quality is what makes this different from the stories of shared private information that have appeared elsewhere tonight. Being in the room while someone tells your story is different from discovering that your story has traveled to rooms you were not in. The former is immediate and public and produces a specific kind of helplessness that I have not encountered in any other context. You are present for the telling. You are the subject of the telling, and the audience for the telling does not yet know what the telling is going to cost you, which means the cost is being calculated while the audience is watching, and you cannot control the calculation. My friend's name was Leo, and the gathering was a dinner party at which 8 people were present, some of whom I knew well, and some of whom I knew less well, and one of whom I had met for the first time that evening. The dinner was going well in the ordinary way of gatherings, where the people are compatible, and the food is good, and the conversation has found its register. I was comfortable. I had arrived feeling good about the evening and the people in it. Leo was telling a story. He was a good storyteller. It was one of the things I'd always liked about him, the specific quality of attention he brought to the shape of a narrative and the moment of its telling. The story he was telling I did not recognize in its opening lines, which is the specific detail that I return to most often, that I did not recognize my own story in its opening. By the time I recognized it, the story was in its middle, with the specific momentum of a narrative that a good storyteller has built to a point from which there is no natural interruption, and the audience was engaged in the way of people who are inside a good story and do not know they are inside something that is costing the person to their left something significant. I did not stop him. I want to be honest about that because the not stopping is the part I've examined most carefully in the years since. Ricky, I did not stop him because stopping him would have confirmed the story as mine in a room where its connection to me was not yet explicit, and the confirmation in that room in that moment felt like the worst option. I sat and I listened to my own worst period, described to 7 other people by the person I had trusted most with it, and I kept my face into the configuration of someone who was listening to a story about someone else. He saw my face at some point in the telling. I know this because his face changed in a way that told me he had, in the momentum of the storytelling, not fully tracked who was in the room, or had tracked it and had not tracked the cost until he saw it. The story concluded. I excused myself shortly after and went to the bathroom and stood at the sink for a while, and then went back to the dinner table and finished the evening with a performance of normalcy that I will count as one of the more difficult things I have done in a social context. I called Leo the following morning. He was already in the mode of someone who had been awake with what he had done and who received my call as the thing he had been waiting for. He said he was sorry before I had said anything beyond his name. The sorry was real. It was also not sufficient, and I told him it was not sufficient, and he said he knew. What he told me about why it had happened was not a justification. He did not attempt a justification, and I would not have received one. He said the story had come up in the natural way, that stories come up when you are a person who tells stories, and that he had been into the momentum of the telling before he had fully accounted for the room, and that by the time he had accounted for the room, the story had its own forward motion, that he had not known how to stop without making the stopping worse than the continuing. I said I understood the mechanics of it, and that the mechanics did not address the fact that the story had not been his to tell in any room at any momentum. The friendship did not survive, not because of the single event in isolation, but because the event revealed something about how Leo held the things I had trusted him with that I could not unknow once I knew it. And the story had been in him as a story for him to tell, rather than as a confidence for him to keep. And the difference between those two things is the whole of what I had trusted him with, and the whole of what the trust turned out not to have secured. And that's that. Being present in the room while someone tells your story is named correctly at the start as its own specific category of exposure, distinct from the other kinds of private information traveling to rooms you were not in. And the distinction is important because the presence changes the nature of the helplessness involved, which is immediate and public and uncontrollable in a way that the retrospective discovery of distant sharing is not. The narrator's not stopping being the choice that prevented confirmation in the room is the kind of real-time calculation that people make in impossible social situations, and that deserves acknowledgement rather than second-guessing. The friendship ending not from the event alone, but from what the event revealed about how Leo held things, is the correct accounting. The event was the data point. The pattern it confirmed was the reason. This one is from someone who had a friend group navigate a significant event together and discovered, in the aftermath, that the group's collective memory of the event had been shaped by one person in a way that served that person's account of it, rather than the account the narrator recognized as accurate. The event was a falling out between me and a member of the group that had been witnessed by several other members, and that had, in my understanding, a fairly clear sequence of causes and a fairly specific set of things that had been said by each party. I was not without fault in what had happened. I want to establish that clearly, because the story is not about my blamelessness. It is about something that happened to the shared memory of the event, rather than about the event itself. Both parties had contributed to the falling out, and I had never claimed otherwise. What I discovered over the months following the event was that the version of it circulating in the group had a shape that was different from my experience of it in a consistent and specific direction. No, the differences were not dramatic. No one was claiming I had done something I had not done or said something I had not said. The differences were in the weighting of things, what received emphasis and what was passed over, what was remembered in detail and what was described in summary, whose emotional experience of the event was rendered with specificity, and whose was described from the outside. The person whose account had shaped the circulating version was named Gil, and he was the other party in the falling out. I understood, once I had enough of the circulating version to see its shape, that Gil had been telling the story of the event with a frequency and a specificity that I had not matched. He had been telling it, and I had not been. Cox, which meant the group's primary source for the event's texture, had been the party with the most interest in a particular version of it. I had not been telling this story because I had believed the event was something the group had witnessed, and that the witnessed version was what the group had. The witnessed version and the told version were not the same thing, which was what I had failed to account for. Witnessing an event gives you access to its surface. A version told by someone invested in its interpretation gives you access to an interior that the witnessing did not include, and the interior Gil had provided to the group had organized the witnessed surface into a shape that served his account, rather than the event's complexity. I raised this with a group member I trusted, a woman named Yara, who I believed had enough independent judgment to receive what I was saying, without filtering it entirely through the version she had already been given. Yara listened and said she had noticed the version had a particular shape, and had not examined where the shape came from. She said she was not sure she could evaluate what I was telling her against the version she already had, because the version she already had was more complete in its detail, and therefore more available to her memory as the account of the event. That last part was the most honest and most difficult thing she said. The version that had been told more often and in more detail had more purchase in the group's memory than the witnessed version. And not because it was more accurate, but because it had been given more narrative form. A story told well is remembered better than an event witnessed partially, and Gil had told the story well, across months of group life, while I had been silent on the assumption that silence was what the situation called for. I began telling my own version, not in a campaign, in the specific way of someone who has understood that the choice between silence and participation is not the same as the choice between dignity and self-promotion, and that silence in a situation where a version is already circulating is not neutrality, but cession. I told it to Yara first and then to other members of the group in conversations where the event was relevant, and I told it as my experience of the event, rather than as a correction of Gil's version, which was a framing choice that I made deliberately, because the correction framing requires a verdict on Gil's version, while the experience framing simply adds another account to the available information. The group's memory of the event is now more contested than it was when only one version was available. That is not the same as the accurate version prevailing, which I cannot guarantee, but it is better than the previous state, which was a single account presented as the complete picture. I have made peace with the contested quality, with the understanding that the group's members will hold different versions of the event, and that what I can offer is my own account, rather than a definitive resolution of whose account is right. Gil and I are not in the same social configuration anymore. The falling out was real regardless of whose version of it is held. What I am in is a group where the history is more fully represented than it was, which is the most accurate possible outcome of a situation where accuracy was not available from the beginning. That's where that one lands. The distinction between witnessing an event and being given an interpretation of it is the conceptual center of this story. Witnessing gives you access to surface, and the interior that makes the surface legible requires someone to provide it. And the person most invested in a particular interior is the one most likely to be providing it most often. The narrator's realization that silence in a situation where aversion is already circulating is cession rather than neutrality, is the most practically useful insight in the story. And the decision to add their own account as an experience rather than a correction is the right strategic choice because it bypasses the verdict on Gill problem while still introducing the missing information into the group's available knowledge. The next story is from someone who had a friendship of 11 years on, in a way that left them unable to name what had caused the ending for more than a year, and who eventually found the cause in the last place they expected. For 11 years, Nadia and I had been the kind of friends who did not require maintenance in the way that some adult friendships require it. Regular contact, scheduled calls, deliberate effort to keep the connection from eroding. The friendship had a quality of resilience that I had always attributed to its genuine foundation, and that I had trusted to carry it through the ordinary intervals of adult life, where contact becomes less frequent without the friendship becoming less real. We went months sometimes without speaking and picked up where we had left off, without the awkwardness that gaps produce in friendships built on more fragile ground. The ending did not announce itself as an ending. It arrived as one of those ordinary intervals that extended beyond its ordinary length, and then extended further, and then continued to extend, until the interval had become something other than an interval, and I was no longer sure how to characterize what it had become. That I attempted contact several times across the extending period. Messages that were responded to with warmth and brevity, suggestions that were received positively and not followed through on. The warmth was always there, and the distance was always there, and the two together produced the specific confusion of something that did not feel over and was not producing anything that felt like continuance. I went through the period before the interval began, looking for the thing I had done or failed to do that had produced the distance. I went through it carefully and with the honest intention of finding something, rather than exonerating myself, because if I had done something, I wanted to know about it. The examination did not produce a clear answer. There was nothing I could identify that constituted a rupture or a betrayal, or the kind of carelessness that ends things. There was just that interval and its extending. A mutual friend of ours, a woman named Priya who had known us both for years, and who had the specific position of someone trusted by both parties, in a situation that had become uncomfortable for everyone adjacent to it, said something to me in month 14 of the interval that she had apparently been deciding about for some time. She said she thought I deserved to know something, even though the knowing was going to be complicated and was not going to resolve the interval cleanly. What Priya told me was that Nadia had gone through something significant in the period just before the interval began. A health situation that had reorganized her sense of who she wanted to spend her limited energy with and how. The reorganization had not been directed at me specifically. Priya was clear about this. It was a broad reassessment of relationships that had produced a narrowing of her active social world to the people and connections she found most sustaining. I had not been into the narrowed version. Not because of anything specific about me or about us, because the friendship in Nadia's assessment was one whose resilience across intervals had made it feel like one that could sustain a longer interval than the others, which meant it was the one that had received the interval that the situation required. I sat with this for a long time. The specific quality of being the friendship selected for the longer interval because of its perceived resilience was something I had not anticipated as a possible cause, and it reorganized the 11 years in a way that was more complicated than the simpler versions I had considered. I had not been let go because the friendship was weak. I had been let go because the friendship was strong, in the specific and painful sense that strong things are trusted to survive what fragile things are protected from. I reached out to Nadia with what Priya had told me, and with the honest account of what the 14 months had been like from my side, where she responded with more than she had given me across the 14 months of warm brevity, with a fuller version of what had been happening, and what the narrowing had required, and what the interval had been about. The conversation was not the restoration of the friendship. It was the honest accounting of its suspended state, an acknowledgement of what it was and what the narrowing had produced, and what both of us had been inside, without being able to describe it to each other. We are in contact now in a form that is not the 11-year form and is not the 14-month interval. Something in between that is honest about its own reduced frequency and that I hold without requiring it to be what it was. The resilience that made the friendship the one selected for the interval is now, into the post-conversation form, made the thing that makes the reduced form workable. We can hold a friendship at a lower frequency than before, because the friendship was always able to hold across intervals. And the interval is now acknowledged rather than unspoken, which changes its character from abandonment to a pause that was named too late and is now named. There it is. The friendship being selected for the longer interval because of its perceived resilience is the specific turn the story takes that most stories about friendship endings do not take. The strength of the connection being the reason for its suspension, rather than a sign that the suspension was not as serious as it seemed. Being trusted to survive what fragile things are protected from is the formulation that makes the thing both more painful and more comprehensible simultaneously. And both of those things are true at once, rather than the comprehension resolving the pain. The reduced form being workable because the resilience was real is the ending that the story earns, not restoration, not loss, but the honest acknowledgement of a changed thing that is still the thing it was, at a different frequency. Here's one from someone who was in a close friend group for 9 years and watched the group navigate the discovery that one of its members had been lying to all of them about something significant for most of those 9 years. The member's name was Dan, and the lie was about his professional life, which I'm going to describe in structure rather than in specific, because the specific belongs to him. And the structure is what the story is actually about, and he had represented himself across the 9 years as being in a professional situation that was more established than the actual situation, not a fabrication from whole cloth. There was a real professional life and a real trajectory, and the lie was about where on the trajectory he was rather than about whether the trajectory existed. He had been telling the group a version of his professional life that was approximately 18 months ahead of where he actually was, which had required across 9 years a consistent and detailed maintenance of the gap between the actual and the represented. And the discovery came through a circumstance that was incidental rather than investigative. A member of the group encountered evidence of the actual situation in a professional context that made the gap between it and the represented situation immediately legible. The member brought this to the group rather than to Dan directly, which was a choice that produced a group conversation about Dan in Dan's absence before any conversation with Dan himself, which I want to name as a problem, distinct from the original problem, because it was a problem and it shaped what followed. Dan was told by the group collectively, which is the worst possible delivery mechanism for information about a discovered deception, in which the group assembled as the approach without examining its dynamics carefully enough. The collective delivery produced a confrontational quality that was not intended, and that made Dan's ability to receive and respond to what was being said significantly harder than a one-on-one conversation would have made it. I was part of the collective, and I'm including myself in the critique. What Dan told us about the 9 years was more complicated than any of us had been prepared for. The lie had not begun as a lie. It had begun as an ordinary inflation of where he was, the kind of rounding up that people do when they are in the gap between where they are and where they are going, and find the gap uncomfortable to represent accurately. The rounding up had hardened into a consistent representation over the years, not because he had decided to deceive the people he was closest to, but because the consistent representation had accumulated around him in a way that made the correction increasingly harder to make. Each year, the gap between the represented and the actual had been both smaller, because the trajectory was real and he was moving along it, and more entrenched because the represented version had 9 years of the group's assumptions built around it. He was ashamed, not in a performed way, in the specific quality of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has had it taken from them in a way that was also a relief, in the complicated way that exposure sometimes is. The shame and the relief existed in the same moment, and in the same face, and the seeing of both in the same face was the most human thing in the whole situation, and the thing that I have thought about most since. The group navigated the aftermath imperfectly, which is the honest assessment rather than the generous one. 2 members withdrew from Dan in ways that I found disproportionate to the nature of the deception. 2 members overcorrected in the direction of treating the deception as categorically insignificant, in a way that also missed the mark. I tried to hold a position that acknowledged both the realness of the 9 years and the realness of the thing that had been running alongside the 9 years, without fully inhabiting either extreme, which was the right position and was harder to maintain than either extreme would have been. And Dan is still part of a configuration that includes most of the original group. The configuration required adjustment, and the adjustment required time, and the time produced something that is smaller and more honest than the 9-year group had been. Honest about what it contains, and honest about what the 9 years contain, which was both a genuine set of connections and a maintained gap that all of those connections had been built alongside without knowing it. And that's that. The rounding up hardening into a consistent representation is the mechanism that explains the 9 years without requiring deliberate, sustained deception as its engine, which is what most people who maintain long-term deceptions of this kind are actually doing, not choosing to deceive the people they love, but failing to correct a representation that has accumulated too much weight to address simply year after year until the weight is someone else's problem to lift. The group confrontation being named as its own problem is the kind of self-implication that makes this narrator credible. And the 2 extremes of the group's response being identified as both missing the mark is the honest assessment that the more complicated middle position was the right one and the hardest one to hold. This one is from someone who spent 4 years being the person in their friend group that everyone brought their problems to, and discovered in year 5 that the role had been specifically cultivated by the group, rather than organically arrived at. My position in the group had always been the listener, the one who held things. I'm the person whose apartment people arrived at when something had gone wrong, and whose phone received the calls that came before anyone else's. I'd understood this role as the natural expression of the kind of person I was. I am patient, and I am genuinely interested in other people's interior lives, and I do not find the weight of someone else's difficulty a burden in the way that some people find it. The role had felt like mine because it fit who I was, rather than because it had been assigned. What I found in year 5 was that the role had been discussed among the group in a way that suggested it was understood by the group as a role, rather than as a natural expression of my character. A friend named B told me this with the specific discomfort of someone who has decided that telling is more honest than not telling, and who is not certain the telling was the right decision, even while making it. She said the group had, at some point in the first year, arrived at an informal and never explicitly stated understanding that I was the person for certain kinds of difficulty, and that the understanding had been operative since without being examined or questioned or shared with me. I asked B what she meant by the understanding being operative. She said it meant that when members of the group were going through things, the question of who to bring it to was not open. It was answered by the understanding before it was consciously asked. I was the answer. The group had a system, and the system had a person, and I was the person, and I had not been told I was the person because the telling might have changed, whether I wanted to be the person. That last part is what I sat with most carefully. B had identified, without seeming fully aware that she had identified it, the specific reason the understanding had not been shared with me. Because my consent to the role might not have been given, or might have been given differently than the role required, and the role was more useful to the group if my consent was not sought. Not maliciously. The group was not a collective of people who had gathered to exploit my patience. They were a group of people who had found something useful and had used it without examining the using, which is different from malice and is still a problem. As I thought about the 4 years and the weight I had carried and the pleasure I had genuinely taken in carrying it. Because the pleasure was real, I want to say that clearly, the genuine interest in my friends' interior lives had been satisfied by the role in ways that mattered to me. What had not been satisfied was the reciprocal version of it. I was the listener and the holder, and the person arrived at with problems. And what I had not been, across the 4 years, was the person who arrived with problems of my own and found the same quality of reception. I raised it with the group. Not as an indictment, as an observation about what the 4 years had produced in terms of how the group's weight had been distributed. The group received it with varying levels of self-awareness about the understanding Bay had described. Some members had not consciously known about the understanding and were surprised to hear it described. Some had known and had accepted it as the natural expression of who I was, rather than as a system that had been constructed around me. The conversation was uncomfortable and necessary, and produced a genuine shift in how the group operated in the subsequent years. I am still the person people come to with difficulties, not because the role was reassigned to me, but because the genuine interest in my friends' interior lives is still mine, and the role fits it. What is different is that the group now comes to me also with the other things, with the good news and the ordinary days, and the petty complaints and the nothing in particular contact that had been going to other members, rather than to me because I had been understood as the person for the heavy things. The full range of what the group has is now more evenly distributed than the 4-year system had distributed it, and the full range is what I needed rather than how the specialized version the system had been providing. There it is. The consent being the thing the understanding had not sought, because seeking it might have changed whether it was given, is the most honest accounting of why systems like this one persist in friend groups without being named. Nobody decided to exploit the listener, and they found the listener and used what the listener offered and did not examine the using, because the using was comfortable and the examining might have disrupted it. The narrator's genuine pleasure and the role being named, alongside the problem it contained, is what keeps this from being a simple grievance. The role fit, the pleasure was real. The problem wasn't the exclusivity of the role rather than the role itself. What the group needed to give was the full range, and what the group was giving was the specialized version. And the full range is what made the distribution feel like a relationship rather than an arrangement. This one is from someone who had a friend of 7 years go through a significant life change and discovered in the aftermath of the change that the person who had emerged on the other side of it was operating on a set of values that had silently reclassified the narrator without telling them. Her name was Claire, and the life change was a religious conversion that had happened gradually across a 2-year period, and that I had been aware of in the way that you are aware of a friend's evolving interests, present at the edges of conversations, occasionally more central, never the subject of a direct conversation about what it meant for the friendship, or for how Claire understood the people in her life. I had not raised the subject directly because it seemed like her business rather than mine, and she had not raised it directly because I think she was not yet certain how to raise something that was still forming into its final shape. After the reclassification I am describing was not hostile. I want to be clear about this because the story could be received as a story about religious intolerance. And it is not that kind of story. Claire did not become hostile toward me or toward the aspects of my life that her new framework evaluated differently than her previous one had. What she became was careful in a way she had not previously been. A slight management of what she shared with me, a slight adjustment in what she asked about, a quality of prayerful consideration that I could feel in the texture of our interactions without being able to point to a specific instance of it. I noticed it across year 6 of the friendship, without being able to name it as clearly as I can name it now. What I noticed was that the friendship had acquired a quality of monitored warmth. Warmth that was genuine, but that was being expressed through a filter I had not previously been aware of. The filter was not producing coldness. It was producing a kind of careful temperature regulation that was different from the unregulated warmth of the first 5 years. In year 7, I asked Claire directly whether something had changed and how she thought about our friendship. The asking required more courage than I had expected it to, because I was not certain I wanted the answer, which is often a signal that the question is necessary. She was honest in the way I had always known her to be honest. She said yes, something had changed, and that the change was about how her framework now understood some aspects of my life that had not previously been the subject of evaluation, and that were now, within the framework she was living inside, things she held differently than she had before. She said the friendship itself was not in question. She wanted that to be clear first. She said her care for me was not in question. What was in question, or rather, what had been quietly answered without being discussed, was how she engaged with the specific parts of my life that the framework evaluated as things to be held at a distance rather than engaged with directly. She said she had been navigating this privately rather than discussing it with me because she had not known how to discuss it without it sounding like a judgment, which it was not intended to be. I told her I understood the distinction between a judgment and a framework that produces different behavior toward the same person, and that from my side, the distinction was harder to maintain than it might be from hers. If the framework caused her to engage with some parts of my life differently than she had before, the experience of that different engagement from my side had a quality that was difficult to distinguish from judgment, even if the internal experience for her was different. She said she understood that, and that it was something she was still working out how to hold. We had several more conversations across year 7 that were more honest than the previous 6 years of friendship had required. The honesty was harder than the previous conversations had been, and produced something I had not expected, which was a clearer understanding of what the friendship was and what it could contain than the previous unexamined warmth had provided. The unexamined warmth had been easy and had contained assumptions that turned out not to be accurate. The examined version was harder and was accurate, and the accuracy was worth the hardness, even when the hardness was significant. Claire and I are still friends. The friendship operates within constraints that were not present in the first 5 years, and that I did not choose, and that she did not impose, deliberately so much as arrive at through a change in herself that had implications she was still working out. I hold it as a friendship that is more limited than it was, and more honest about its limits than the unexamined version had been about its assumptions. That is not the friendship I would have designed. It is the friendship that is available, and I have decided the available version is worth having rather than not having, which is a decision I have made actively rather than by default, which is itself a kind of progress over the assumption that had been doing the work before. That's where that one lands. The monitored warmth being harder to distinguish from judgment from the narrator's side than from Claire's is the specific observation that names why this kind of situation is difficult, even when nobody is acting in bad faith. The experience of the filter is not determined by the intention behind it, and the person on the receiving end of careful temperature regulation cannot always access the internal distinction between evaluation and care that the person producing it is relying on. The friendship, being more limited and more honest about its limits than the prior version was about its assumptions, is the most accurate description of what the conversation produced. Not restoration to a prior state, but a clearer picture of the current one. The next story is from someone who spent 8 years as the anchor of a friend group, the person who organized gatherings, maintained the group chat, remembered the birthdays, and discovered at year 8 that the anchoring had produced a specific and previously unexamined dynamic that had costs they had been absorbing without knowing it. My name for what I did in the group is organizational infrastructure, which is not a glamorous description, but is the accurate one. I sent the message that turned a vague plan into a specific event. I followed up when things were in danger of falling through the gaps of everyone's individual busyness. I tracked the information, the birthdays, the significant occasions, the things that people had mentioned wanting to do, and I converted the tracking into action. The group functioned with a consistency that I understood as the natural output of a group of people who valued each other, which it was, and which was also the output of one person doing the work that a consistency requires. I did not experience the work as work for most of the 8 years. It was satisfying in the way that work that fits your particular aptitudes is satisfying. I am organized. I like seeing things come together. The specific pleasure of assembling people who are glad to see each other was a pleasure I had access to regularly and that I valued. I was not performing a labor I resented. I was doing something I was good at that also happened to be the thing the group needed. The cost became visible in year 8 through a specific incident that I had not been prepared for, and that reframed the previous 8 years in a way I needed several months to fully process. The incident was a birthday, mine. My birthday arrived in year 8, and the group, without the organizational infrastructure that usually produced events, produced nothing. Not a message, not a gathering, not the ordinary acknowledgement that the infrastructure had ensured I provided for every other member of the group every year. The day passed, and the day after passed, and by the end of the week, I had received individual messages from 3 of the 8 group members, and nothing organized from the group as a whole. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt because the accurate description is more complicated than hurt, which is the simple version. Hurt was present. What was also present was the specific clarity that hurt sometimes produces. The sudden visibility of a dynamic that had been invisible precisely because the infrastructure had been preventing the conditions that would make it visible. The group had not been ignoring my birthday for 8 years. The group had been relying on me to ensure that no birthday, including mine, went unacknowledged. And in the specific case of my own birthday, that reliance had produced an absence rather than the presence it produced for everyone else. I said something, not immediately. I gave myself 2 weeks, which was the time I needed to be able to say what I actually wanted to say, rather than what the hurt in the immediate aftermath would have produced. I told the group what the birthday week had been like from my side, and I told them the larger thing the birthday week had made visible, which was 8 years of organizational work that had been done by one person, and that the group had been the beneficiary of without examining who was doing it or what it cost. The group's response surprised me in its quality. There was no defensiveness. Or there was, briefly, in one member, and it resolved quickly when the other members did not join it. What the group produced instead was a genuine and specific accounting of what they had assumed, without examining, and what the assuming had produced for me across 8 years. Not 2 members had not known they were assuming anything. They had believed the organization happened organically, which is the specific invisibility of good organizational work, that its success makes its effort imperceptible. The other members had known on some level that I was doing more than my share and had told themselves I liked doing it, which was true and did not resolve the issue. The group restructured its organizational responsibilities after that conversation. Not perfectly. The restructuring required that other people develop capacities that I had always handled, and the development was imperfect and occasionally produced the gaps that the infrastructure had been preventing. The gaps were uncomfortable and also instructive because living with some of the gaps was part of how the group understood concretely what the infrastructure had been doing. I am no longer the sole organizational infrastructure of the group. The group functions with less consistency than it did for 8 years and with more equity than it did, and I have decided that the equity is worth the reduced consistency in a way that I could not have decided before year 8 because I did not have the information that year 8 produced, and that's that. The birthday being the incident that made the dynamic visible is the structurally correct incident for this story because it is the one instance where the infrastructure that prevented the visibility was not present, and the absence of the infrastructure and the specific case of the narrator's own birthday produced exactly the outcome that the infrastructure had been preventing for everyone else across 8 years. The invisibility of good organizational work being its success is the observation that explains why the group's default to the narrator had gone unexamined. The work disappears when it works, and its disappearance is evidence of its success, which makes it very difficult to see until it stops. The equity being worth the reduced consistency is the right conclusion, stated as an active decision rather than a default, which is the distinction between having made peace with something and simply having accepted it. This one is from someone who had a friendship that survived everything: distance, life changes, and years of reduced contact, and did not survive the one thing they had not expected to test it. Rory and I had been friends since we were 19, and had maintained the friendship across the kind of life divergence that ends many relationships formed that early. Different cities, different life trajectories, the significant personal events that happen to people across their 20s and 30s that reorganize their worlds in ways that the people they knew before those events did not always have access to. We had stayed close in the specific way that some long friendships stay close, which is not through constant contact, but through the quality of contact when it happened. The ability to pick up without the awkwardness that gaps produce, under the specific fluency of two people who have known each other long enough that the knowing is into the bones rather than in the maintenance. The thing that tested the friendship was a disagreement. Not about a personal matter, about something external, a situation in the world that we found ourselves on different sides of, with a specificity that surprised both of us because we had, across 20 years of friendship, aligned closely enough on the things that mattered to us. That significant disagreement had not been a frequent feature of the relationship. I want to be careful about the subject of the disagreement because the subject is not the point, and because the subject is the kind of thing that invites people to take sides about the disagreement, rather than attending to what the disagreement produced in the friendship. What I will say is that the disagreement was genuine and that both positions were held sincerely, and that neither of us was operating in bad faith, and that the disagreement was not resolvable through additional information or more careful reasoning because it was not primarily a factual disagreement, but a values disagreement, which is the kind that is most resistant to resolution. We tried to have the conversation several times across several months. The trying was genuine on both sides, and the conversations were honest in a way that conversations between people who have known each other for 20 years and are not performing for an audience can be honest. What the honesty produced was a clearer picture of the disagreement rather than a resolution of it. Each conversation made the values difference more legible and more specific, and less amenable to the kind of bridging that factual disagreements allow for. Rory said at some point in the third or fourth conversation that he was finding it difficult to hold the friendship and the disagreement simultaneously, that the disagreement had a weight that was affecting how the friendship felt to him, not as an intellectual matter, but as an emotional one. The specific difficulty of feeling genuinely at odds with someone you have known and loved for 20 years on something that felt to him like it went to the center of who both of you were. I said I understood the difficulty and that I was feeling a version of it as well. What followed the third or fourth conversation was a period of reduced contact that neither of us named as reduced contact, but that both of us knew was different from the ordinary intervals of our friendship. The interval was not the resilient kind that picks up where it left off. It was the kind that has something sitting in it that the not speaking has not resolved, and that the speaking has not been able to resolve either. We have spoken twice in the 18 months since. Both conversations were warm in the way that 20 years of history makes warmth available even across significant distance. Neither conversation addressed the disagreement directly because both of us had understood, by the time of the first of those two conversations, that the addressing was not going to produce anything the previous conversations had not produced. We were holding a friendship and a disagreement, and the two had not found a way to coexist that worked for both of us. And we were living in the interval that the coexistence failure had produced, with the warmth of 20 years available to us, and without the frequency that the friendship had previously carried. I do not know what this becomes. The not knowing is the honest state of it. I have friendships that have survived serious tests and emerged changed and intact. I have friendships that did not survive serious tests. I do not yet know which category this is, and I have decided not to require the knowing before the situation has produced its own answer. What I have in the meantime is the warmth and the interval, and the 20 years, and the 20 years are not nothing, even when what they are is not yet determined. That's the full picture. The disagreement being a values disagreement rather than a factual one is the distinction that makes the conversation's inability to resolve it not a failure of effort, but a feature of what a values disagreement actually is. More legible honesty produced not a bridgeable gap, but a clearer picture of a gap that the additional information was not going to close. The interval that has something sitting in it being different from the resilient interval that picks up where it left off is the most precise description of what happens to a long friendship when the disagreement is not resolved and the contact reduces, not the same as the ordinary intervals of a friendship's life, but heavier, shaped by the unresolved thing, the not knowing being the honest state and the decision not to require the knowing before it has produced its own answer, is the most mature available position and also the hardest to hold. This one comes from someone who watched their friend group spend 2 years navigating a situation that had no clean resolution and who found, at the end of the 2 years, that the navigating had produced something more important than a resolution would have. The situation was this: a member of the group named Will had done something that had genuinely hurt another member of the group named Anna, and the something was real and had real consequences, and was not the kind of thing that a simple apology could fully address. Oh, I'm not going to describe the specific nature of what Will had done, because the specific nature is not mine to describe, and because the structure of what followed is what I want to talk about, which was the group attempting to hold both Will and Anna in the same configuration across 2 years, while the hurt was real and the relationship between them was not. The group had not done anything like this before. We had navigated ordinary conflicts between members and ordinary difficulties in individual members' lives, but we had not navigated a situation where one member had genuinely harmed another and where both the member who had caused the harm and the member who had experienced it needed the group in ways that could not be simultaneously fully met without some cost to the other. And the group could not be fully present for Anna's experience of the harm, while also maintaining its connection to Will, without some of the presence for Anna being compromised. And it could not hold Will with the full complexity of who he was. Not only the person who had done this thing, but also the person who had been a member of the group for 10 years, without some of the accounting for Anna's harm being complicated. I want to describe what the group did rather than what it should have done, because what it did was imperfect, and also, I think, more honest than a cleaner approach would have been. The group did not choose sides formally, and it maintained connection to both Will and Anna in a form that was reduced on both sides from what it had been before. Reduced with Will because what he had done required a period of accountability that full maintenance of the prior connection would have undercut. Reduced with Anna because the group's continued connection to Will was itself a thing Anna had complicated feelings about that the group could not eliminate. The reductions were different in character, and the group was not always consistent in how it maintained them, and the inconsistency was occasionally the source of secondary hurt that the situation's complexity produced. What the 2 years produced at the end of them was not a resolution of the original harm. That resolution was Anna's to arrive at on her own terms and her own timeline, and was not the group's to produce. What it produced was a group that had attempted to hold a genuinely hard thing without resolving it prematurely into a simpler shape, and that had mostly succeeded at the attempting with some failures along the way, and that was more honest about what friendships are required to hold than it had been before the situation arose. Anna and Will are not in the same social configuration any longer. That is the outcome of the situation rather than a failure of the group's navigation, and it is Anna's outcome to have arrived at rather than the group's to have prevented. The group that remains is one that held something difficult for 2 years without choosing a clean answer that would have come at someone's expense, and the holding changed how the group understood what it was capable of and what it owed to its members in situations that did not admit of clean answers. I have thought about those 2 years more than I have thought about most of the friendship's other years because they were the years in which the group was most clearly itself, most clearly the thing it had been accumulating toward across the prior decade. A group's character is not visible in the easy years, the years of ordinary warmth and gatherings and shared history. It becomes visible in the years when it is asked to hold something hard without the comfort of a resolution that would relieve the holding. What the 2 years showed me about the group I have been part of is something I could not have known without the situation that produced it, and the knowledge is worth the cost, even when the cost was real and is in some ways still ongoing. And that's that. The reductions being different in character on each side of the situation is the honest description of what holding both parties in a conflict actually requires. Not identical treatment, but specific treatment, calibrated to the specific position of each person in what happened, which is harder to maintain consistently than a simpler approach and more honest about what the situation actually contains. Adam, the group's character becoming visible in the years when it is asked to hold something hard without the comfort of resolution, is the observation this story is building toward, and the one that makes the 2 years worth the telling. Not what happened, but what the attempt to navigate it honestly revealed about the people who made the attempt. This one is from someone who had a friend of 9 years who was, by every measure, a generous and present person, and who discovered that the generosity had a specific and previously undisclosed condition attached to it that had been operative for the entire 9 years. Her name was Fiona, and the generosity was real. I want to establish that before anything else because the story requires it. She was genuinely giving in the ways that matter most in close friendship, the ways that cost something rather than the ways that are easy. She showed up. She remembered the things that mattered. She gave her time and her attention with a completeness that I had valued for 9 years, and that I had understood as the expression of a person who was simply oriented toward others in a way that was natural to her, rather than effortful. The condition I did not know about revealed itself through a conversation with a mutual friend named Iris in year 9. Iris told me something she had been holding for several years and had finally decided I needed to have, which was that Fiona maintained, in conversations with Iris and occasionally with others, a running account of what the generosity cost her. Not in a martyred way, not with resentment toward me specifically, but with a specificity and regularity that suggested the generosity was being tracked, in a way that I had not known it was being tracked. The tracking was not about expecting repayment. Fiona was not transactional in any obvious sense. It was more like the generosity needed to be witnessed in order to be fully given. And Iris had been the witness, across 9 years, of what I had understood as unwitnessed giving. I sat with what Iris told me, and I tried to understand what it changed about the 9 years and what it left intact. The generosity itself was real. The actions had been taken. The time had been given. The presence had been genuine. What was different was the context of the giving, which had included a witness I had not known about, and a tracking I had not consented to be the subject of. The giving had not been the private act of someone oriented naturally toward others in the way I had understood it. It had been a witnessed and tracked act that required a third party to validate what I had assumed was simply between us. I spoke to Fiona about it. The conversation was the most difficult one I had with anyone that year. Not because of what was said in it, but because of the specific quality of examining something you have valued deeply and finding it different from what you thought it was. I told her what Iris had told me, and I asked her to tell me what was accurate in Iris's account. She said all of it was accurate, and that she had not thought of the telling Iris as something that affected me, because the telling was about her experience rather than about me. I said I understood the distinction, and that the distinction did not fully account for the way the telling had changed the character of what I had received. I had been inside something I understood as a particular kind of giving, private, untracked, simply between two people who cared about each other. The actual thing had a third dimension I had not known was there. Not false, but not the thing I had believed it was either. Fiona was quiet for a long time, and then she said something that was more honest than I had expected, which was that she had always needed the generosity to be seen, because she had not been fully certain it was enough without the seeing. She said the tracking and the telling were not about me. They were about her own uncertainty, about whether what she was giving was sufficient, and the witness was how she managed the uncertainty. The generosity was real, and the need for the witness was also real, and the two had coexisted in the same acts for 9 years, without either canceling the other. I held that explanation for a long time. The generosity being real, and the need for witness being real, and the two coexisting is not a simpler picture than the picture I had before the conversation. It is a more complicated one, and the complication is the truth of it. I have revised my understanding of the 9 years, not to make them less than they were, but to make them accurate, and the accurate version includes both the genuine giving and the specific need that the giving was also serving. I hold it as the full version rather than the partial one, which is harder and more honest than either of the simpler versions available. That's where that one lands. Fiona's explanation, the act of the tracking, and the witness were about her uncertainty, rather than about the narrator, is the most honest thing in the story, and the thing that makes the situation genuinely complicated, rather than simply a betrayal. The generosity being real alongside the need for witness being real is not a contradiction, but a coexistence, and the narrator's decision to hold the accurate version rather than either of the simpler ones available is the maturity that the situation requires. Sometimes the most generous people you know are generous partly in service of something they need, and the need does not make the generosity false. It makes it human, which is different and more complicated, and in the end, more worth understanding. This next one is from someone who spent 6 years as the person in their friend group who held everyone's secrets and discovered in year 6 that the role had made them invisible in a specific and previously unexamined way. My name for what I did in the group was holding. I held what people told me with discretion and care, and I did not share it, and I did not reference it unless the person who had told me referenced it first. I had developed this practice because I understood what it cost to share something with someone and have it handled carelessly, and I did not want to be the source of that cost for the people I was close to. The practice was genuine, and it was mine, and I had maintained it across 6 years of a friendship with a group of 7 people who each had, at various points, trusted me with the things they were not sharing more widely. The invisibility that the holding produced was this. I had shared very little of my own interior with the group across the 6 years. Not because I had nothing to share, but because the habit of holding other people's things had trained me into a version of presence that was primarily receptive, rather than disclosive. I was the person things were brought to, rather than the person who brought things. And the direction of that had been consistent enough across 6 years to have become the group's understanding of who I was inside it. A presence, attentive and caring, without the specific texture of a person who was also going through things and could use the same quality of attention. I understood this in year 6 through a particular conversation where a member of the group named Cam said something to me that was intended as a compliment and that landed as a diagnosis. He said he always felt better after talking to me because I had a way of being present without bringing my own stuff into it, which allowed him to be fully in his own experience without having to attend to mine. He said it with genuine appreciation, and I received it with genuine discomfort that I did not show in the moment, and that I sat with for several weeks afterward. What Cam had complimented was the specific quality I had developed as a practice, and that had become, across 6 years, a persona rather than a choice. The not bringing my own stuff was not the absence of my own stuff. I had plenty of my own stuff. The ordinary difficulties and uncertainties and significant events of a person's life across 6 years. The not bringing was a habit that had calcified into a kind of role, and the role had produced a version of me in the group that was useful and consistent and not fully human, in the way that people who are also going through things are fully human. I changed it slowly rather than suddenly, not through a declaration or a conversation with the group about the dynamic, through the gradual and deliberate practice of bringing my own things into conversations where they were relevant, of answering honestly when people asked how I was instead of redirecting toward them, of allowing the group to hold some of what I had been holding alone, because the holding alone had been producing the invisibility that Cam's compliment had named. The group adjusted to the new version of me with less difficulty than I had expected. Some members of the group expressed, explicitly, that they had wondered whether I was going through things that I wasn't sharing, and had not known how to ask. Some said they had assumed the not sharing meant there was nothing to share, which was the assumption the practice had been inadvertently producing. The adjustment was not perfect. Some members had developed a reliance on the fully receptive version of me that the gradually more disclosive version disrupted. But it was real, and it was in the right direction, and it produced a presence in the group that was mine rather than the shape the group's needs had gradually carved out of me. The holding is still one of my practices. I am still the person in the group who is most reliably discreet and most reliably present when someone needs to be heard. The difference is that the holding is now alongside rather than instead of, which is a small preposition doing significant work. Alongside means the group holds things, and I also bring things, and the traffic moves in both directions with a regularity that 6 years of one-directional traffic had not produced. The group is better for the bidirectionality, and I am better for it, and The version of me that exists inside the group now is the full one, rather than like the useful partial one that Cam had so genuinely and so accurately described. There it is. Cam's compliment, being the diagnosis, is the hinge the story turns on. The appreciation for the practice naming, without intending to. What the practice had produced over 6 years, which was a version of presence that was so consistently receptive, it had eliminated the narrator from the group's picture of a person who was also going through things. The alongside rather than instead of is the right formulation for what changed, because it preserves the practice that was genuinely good while identifying the way it had been functioning as a substitution rather than an addition. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do in a friend group is also the thing that has been making you invisible, and the two facts can coexist long enough to require deliberate intervention before they are understood as a problem rather than a feature. Here's one from someone who had a friend betray them publicly in a way that was small enough to be individually dismissible and large enough to change everything. The betrayal was a joke at my expense told at a gathering of 12 people, several of whom I knew well and several of whom I had just met. My friend's name was Eli, and the joke drew on something I had told him privately, not the something itself, but a particular quality of the something, a specific texture of an experience I had described that he had found funny in the telling, and had apparently not been able to resist translating into a joke for an audience. I want to describe why the smallness of it mattered before I describe the response to it, because the smallness is not incidental to the story. A large betrayal has a weight that the community around it recognizes as weight. A small betrayal has a weight that only the person inside it can fully feel, because from the outside, the weight is not proportionate to the event, and the disproportionate quality makes the person inside it seem oversensitive if they respond with the actual weight they are feeling, rather than the weight the event's external scale permits. I did not respond at the gathering with the actual weight. I laughed with the table and moved the conversation forward and held the weight privately for the duration of the evening. Eli caught my eye once after the joke, and his eye had a quality of checking in that told me he had registered something, even if he was not certain what he had registered. When I gave him nothing in return for the checking in, and went home at the end of the evening with the weight intact, and with several additional things that the weight had collected on the drive home. The additional things were the specific nature of what he had used, the private quality of a particular experience translated into something performed for 12 people, several of whom I had just met, which meant the first impression those people had of me included a version of something I had shared only with Eli. The translation was not accurate in its detail. Jokes are not accurate. But it was accurate enough in its texture that I was legible in the joke to anyone who had also had a version of that experience, which in a room of 12 people was statistically probable, and in the event was confirmed, when a woman I had just met caught my eye in a way that told me she had recognized what the joke was about and understood its private source. I spoke to Eli privately the following day. He was immediately and genuinely sorry. The kind of sorry that arrives before you have finished describing the thing you are sorry about, which tells you the person already knew. He said he had not thought it through before saying it, and that he had known while saying it that it was the wrong call, and had said it anyway because the momentum of the telling had produced its own logic in the moment. I said I understood the momentum logic, and that the momentum logic was not a thing that lived outside of him. It was a thing that his choices about what material was appropriate for public use had produced, and the understanding that what I had told him privately was not in the category of public material was something I had expected him to hold, without my having to specify it. He said he understood that. He said he was sorry, not just for the joke, but for the failure of the holding that had produced it. The using of that specific language, the holding, told me he understood what the actual injury was, rather than just the surface of it, which mattered for how I received the apology. The friendship did not end. It absorbed the incident with the specific work that absorbing a betrayal requires. The work of deciding that the evidence of the incident does not override the evidence of the 9 years before it, and that the evidence of the 9 years is the more accurate picture of who Eli was, while also not allowing the 9 years to simply absorb the incident without its own accounting. Both things got their accounting. The friendship continued past both accountings and is now the friendship of people who have been through something small that was actually large and have come out the other side of it without requiring the other person to be less than the full complicated version of who they are. And that's that. The smallness making the weight invisible to others while it is fully felt by the person inside it is the specific quality of this kind of betrayal that makes it hardest to navigate. The person carrying the weight cannot fully express it without appearing to overrespond to the event's external scale, which means the weight has to be held and processed in a more private way than a larger betrayal would require. Eli's language, the failure of the holding, is the thing that makes the apology land, because it names what the injury actually was, rather than what the event looked like from the outside. 9 years of evidence being weighed against one incident is the specific work of deciding whether to continue a friendship after a betrayal, and the narrator does that work explicitly, rather than defaulting in either direction, which is what the situation actually requires. This one is from someone who had a friend group that stayed together through their 30s and discovered at 40 that the version of themselves the group had been maintaining was a version they had outgrown years earlier, and that the group had been reflecting back to them rather than updating. Her name was the group's understanding of her, rather than a single person's name, which is the specific quality of what I'm trying to describe. The group had known me since my late 20s, and the knowing had produced, across 12 years, a settled picture of who I was within the context of the group. My role, my humor, the specific positions I was understood to hold on things, the way my name appeared in sentences the group produced about me. The picture had been accurate once and had been accurate for several years, and had then continued to be applied to me as I changed in ways that the group's settled picture did not update to include. I became aware of this in my late 30s through a specific accumulation of moments where the group's version of me and my experience of myself were in mild but persistent friction. They expected certain responses from me that I no longer produced naturally and whose production required a kind of performance of an earlier version of myself. They referenced things I had said or felt years before, as though those things were still the current version, and the referencing had a quality of pinning, of holding me in a place I had moved past, out with the warmth of people who loved the version they knew, and the unawareness of people who had not noticed a different version was in the room. I had been performing the earlier version, I realized, with a consistency that had prevented the group from having the information that would have updated their picture. When I was with them, I was more the person they expected than the person I had become, because the person they expected was familiar, and the familiar was comfortable, and the comfort was worth the performance in the individual instance. Across 12 years of individual instances, the performance had become the group's reality, which meant the group's reality was 12 years behind, and I had been the one maintaining the gap, and I raised it with one member of the group first, a woman named Jo, who I had always found the most perceptive of the 7, and who I thought had the best chance of hearing what I was about to say, without filtering it through the settled picture. Jo listened and was quiet for a moment, and then said she had noticed something in the last year or two, without having a name for it, which was that I had seemed slightly elsewhere in group contexts, present and warm, but with a quality of slight removal that she had attributed to stress or life circumstances, rather than to what I was now describing. I told the group the fuller version over a series of conversations rather than in a single gathering, and which was the right pacing for something that required each person to update a 12-year picture with information that the picture's subject had been partly responsible for withholding, The conversations were not always comfortable. Some members of the group had more of their understanding of themselves as my friends invested in the settled picture than others, and the updating required them to examine not only who I was, but how they had been seeing me. What the group became after those conversations was something more current than it had been. A group whose picture of me was closer to the actual version, still imperfect as any group's picture of any member is imperfect, but updated and being actively maintained rather than settled, and being applied across time regardless of the changes accumulating beneath it. I am less comfortable in the group in some ways than I was when I was performing the earlier version, because comfort and accuracy are not always the same thing, and I've decided that accuracy is worth the reduced comfort, which is not a decision I had made before, and that I am still in the process of learning to hold. There it is. The performing of an earlier version having prevented the group from having the information that would have updated their picture is the specific mechanism of the narrator's own contribution to the dynamic. This is not only a story about a group that failed to update its picture, but about a person who made the failure easier by providing the familiar version, which is the more honest and more complicated account. Nui Joe's perceptive observation of the slight elsewhere quality is the kind of noticing that the most attentive people in a group do without always having language for what they are noticing, and it is the detail that confirms the narrator is being received more accurately by at least one person than the settled picture suggests. Accuracy being worth reduced comfort is not a comfortable conclusion, and the narrator does not present it as one, which is what makes it credible. This one is from someone who had a friendship of 10 years that ended not through betrayal or conflict or the gradual drift that takes so many adult friendships, but through a single honest conversation that both parties knew, while they were having it, was the last one. His name was Owen, and we had been close in the specific way of two people who had met at exactly the right moment in their respective lives, both in transition, both trying to understand what the next version of themselves looked like, both finding in the other person a kind of thinking out loud companion that the transition required. The friendship had formed quickly and had deepened quickly and had sustained itself across a decade, with the resilience of something that had been genuinely necessary at its origin and had found ways to remain necessary, as both of us moved past the transition that had produced it. The honest conversation happened on a Saturday in October and was not planned as a last conversation. I had not known going into it that it was what it was. Owen had known, or had known something adjacent to what it was. He had asked to meet with a deliberateness that I had registered without interpreting. And the coffee shop, and the Saturday, and the quality of his presence when I arrived, all had a character that I was reading in real time and not yet understanding. He told me he had been thinking about the friendship for a long time, and that the thinking had produced something he felt he owed me the honesty of. He said the friendship had meant more to him than almost anything in the decade, and that the meaning was not in question. He said what was in question was whether the version of the friendship that was currently available was the version that had produced the meaning, or whether what they were in now was a maintenance of the form of a friendship, whose substance had changed in ways that neither of them had named. I listened to this, and I felt the specific quality of someone hearing a true thing said about something they had also been feeling without having found the language for. The friendship in recent years had had a quality of effort that the early years had not required, not the effort of maintenance that all adult friendships require, but the effort of filling a silence that had developed between us, where the thinking out loud used to be, a silence that we had both been covering with the forms of the friendship, without either of us naming what the forms were covering. I told Owen that what he was describing was something I had been feeling and had not said, but he nodded in the way of someone who had known this and had still needed to be the one to say it. We sat with the acknowledgement for a long time without filling it with the forms of the friendship, which was the most honest thing we had done together in several years, and which had the specific quality of something that is also an ending even before the ending is named. We talked for 3 hours about the decade and what it had been and what both of us had found in the friendship that we'd not found elsewhere, and what the current version was and was not. The conversation was the deepest one we had had in years, because the depth was no longer being managed around the unspoken thing. The unspoken thing was the conversation, and without it to manage around the conversation could be fully itself. At the end of it, Owen said he thought the honest thing was to let the friendship be what it was rather than what it had been, and that what it was might be something that needed a different form than the current one, less frequent, less maintained, more honest about its own reduced frequency, rather than continuing to fill the frequency with the form of something that had changed. I said I thought he was right. We sat with that for a moment, and then we finished our coffee, and we walked out of the coffee shop and said goodbye on the street, in the specific way of people who are saying more than goodbye and both know it. We have spoken twice since that Saturday. Both conversations were warm with a warmth that the decade had built, and were also, in their frequency and their brevity, the form that Owen had described, honest about what it was rather than maintaining the form of what it had been. I hold the friendship at that scale without requiring it to be more than it currently is, which requires a different kind of relationship to loss than I had before the conversation, and a different kind of respect for what honesty between two people who care about each other can produce, even when what it produces is a smaller thing than what preceded it. The 3 hours in the coffee shop are what I return to most. Not the goodbye on the street, which was its own thing and had its own weight. The 3 hours in which the friendship was fully itself, honest and deep, and without the management that the unspoken thing had required, were the friendship at its best, even as they were also the friendship acknowledging its own changed state. Some things are most fully themselves in the moment of their honest ending, and the 10 years that preceded the 3 hours are not diminished by what the 3 hours produced, but completed by it. That's where that one lands. The conversation being the deepest one in years, because the unspoken thing was no longer being managed around, is the structural turn that makes the ending also a fulfillment, rather than only a loss. The friendship found its depth again in the act of being honest about why the depth had been harder to access. Owen knowing he needed to be the one to say it, even though he knew the narrator had been feeling it, is the specific quality of care that makes him someone to hold with warmth rather than with grief. The form that is honest about its own reduced frequency, being better than the maintenance of a form around a changed substance, is not a comfortable conclusion, and is the accurate one, and the narrator's acknowledgement that holding it requires a different relationship to loss than they had before, is the honest accounting of what that kind of ending actually costs. This one is from someone who had a group of friends for 15 years and who discovered in the 15th year that the thing holding the group together had not been what any of them had believed it was, and we had believed the thing holding us together was the history. 15 years of accumulated shared experience, the mythology and the references, and the specific knowledge of each other that long time produces. History is a real thing, and it was real in our group, and I am not revising the reality of it. What I am describing is the discovery that the history had been doing less structural work than we had believed, and that the thing doing the structural work was something smaller and more specific and more fragile than history, which is the specific effort of two people in the group who had been the connective tissue between all the others, and whose effort, when it reduced for reasons that were specific to their own lives, revealed how much of the group's apparent cohesion had been running through them. And their names were Sol and Mara, and they had been in the group from the beginning, and had been, in ways none of the rest of us had fully examined, the people who converted the history into ongoing contact, who organized the gatherings, who maintained the connections between the members, who were less naturally in contact with each other, who remembered the things and acted on the remembering in the ways that turn a set of people who share a history into a group that is still actively a group, rather than a group that used to be one. Sol went through a significant personal difficulty in year 14, and Mara moved to another city at the start of year 15. Neither event was a departure from the group. Both of them remained members in intention and in affection. What reduced was the organizational energy, the connective effort, varied the specific maintenance that they had been providing. The reduction was gradual, and neither of them had announced it, because they had not experienced it as a withdrawal from the group, but as a natural reduction in capacity during difficult personal circumstances. The group felt the reduction within 3 months, not as a loss of the two of them, as a loss of the mechanism they had been operating, which the rest of us had been the beneficiaries of without fully understanding it. The gatherings became less frequent, and when they happened because someone had finally sent a message after a long gap, rather than because the organizational infrastructure was maintaining the frequency. The group chat reduced in a way that conversations reduce when the people who animated them are less present. The connections between members who were not naturally in direct contact with each other, the connections that Sol and Mara had been actively maintaining, became thinner as the maintaining reduced. I named what I was observing at month 4 of the reduction, not to Sol or Mara, to the other members of the group, who were experiencing the same reduction without having examined what was producing it. I said the group's cohesion had been running through 2 people, more than any of us had known, and that the running through had become visible now that the 2 people were less available to run it, and that the question in front of us was whether the rest of the group was going to allow the reduction to continue until the group was no longer a group, in any active sense, or whether we were going to understand what had been sustaining us and take collective responsibility for it. The conversation this produced was uncomfortable in the specific way of conversations that require people to examine their own passivity. Most of the group had been receiving the group's organizational output without contributing to it in proportion to what they received. And the receiving had felt like participation, because participation and presence are easy to conflate when someone else is doing the work that makes the presence possible. The examination required each person to be honest about what they had been contributing versus receiving, which produced a range of responses from defensive to genuinely self-aware and everything in between. Everything. The group in year 15 is smaller than the group in year 1, and more deliberately maintained than the group in years 2 through 13. 4 of the original 12 are the current active core, with others present at intervals that are honest about their intervals, rather than trying to maintain the form of a frequency the intervals don't support. Sol is part of the active core, Mara is one of the interval members, close and valued and present, less often for reasons that are her own, and that the group holds without requiring her to perform a frequency she cannot currently sustain. What year 15 produced was an understanding of the group that the 14 years before it had not required. The history is still real. The affection is still real. What is also real is a clearer picture of how groups are actually maintained. Not through history alone, not through affection alone, but through the specific and often invisible effort of people who convert those things into ongoing contact. And the knowledge of that effort and who has been providing it is the thing that 15 years had not produced, and that the reduction in year 14 and 15 finally did. There it is. The reduction revealing the mechanism rather than the group's value is the structural move that makes this story a lesson about groups rather than a story about loss. The history and affection were real, and the connective tissue was real, and the distinction between them is what the reduction made visible. The conversation about passivity being uncomfortable in the specific way of conversations that require people to examine their own receiving without having examined their contributing is accurate to how that kind of conversation lands, and the narrator's willingness to initiate it is the move that produces the smaller and more honest version of the group that year 15 contains. The most durable groups are not the ones with the most history, but the ones who eventually understand what their history has been running on. The last story tonight is from someone who spent 20 years in a friendship that was, by the accounting of both parties, the most significant relationship of their adult lives, and who found at the 20-year mark that the most significant relationship of their adult lives had been asking them a question they had not been answering. Her name was Ruth, and we had met at 22 and been each other's primary witness across everything that followed. The careers and the relationships and the losses and the significant personal developments that 20 years of adult life produces in two people who are paying attention to each other. I knew Ruth with the completeness of someone who has been paying that kind of attention for 2 decades, and she knew me the same way. And the knowing was the most valuable thing in my life. In the specific and non-sentimental sense, that I would have been a less accurate version of myself without the friction and the reflection and the specific quality of being genuinely known by another person across a significant span of time. The question the friendship had been asking arrived in the 21st year in the form of a conversation Ruth initiated with the quality of something that had been building toward articulation for some time. She said she had been thinking about what the friendship required from each of them, and whether what it required was being given in the proportions the friendship needed to be what it had been. She said this carefully and with the specific vocabulary of two people who have been honest with each other for 20 years and know how to have difficult conversations in the register those conversations require. What she was describing, as it became clear across the conversation, was a feeling she had carried for several years, that the friendship had been asking something of her, that she had been giving without examining whether the giving was sustainable. Not the ordinary requirements of close friendship: presence, attention, honesty, time, something more specific. She said the friendship had required, from her side, a quality of holding that went beyond what most friendships require. Holding my uncertainty, my processing, the specific way I worked through things, which was lengthy and thorough, and which she had been present for across 20 years, with a completeness that had produced, without either of us designing it, an asymmetry in the direction of who was being held. I received this with the specific quality of someone hearing a version of something they have heard before in a different context. The directional asymmetry, the unexamined imbalance, the giving that had been received without being fully seen. I had heard versions of this from other people and other relationships, and I had thought I had addressed it in myself. And here it was again, in the most significant relationship of my adult life, in the 21st year, articulated by the person whose account of me I trusted most in the world. I told Ruth I heard her. I did not defend myself, and I did not immediately explain, because the defense and the explanation were both the thing she was describing: the processing, the working through, the thorough and lengthy engagement with difficulty that she had been the container for across 20 years. I sat with what she had said, and I let it be what it was, without making it the subject of immediate and effortful engagement, which was itself a different response than the one the friendship had been producing from me, and which felt, in the moment of it, like the beginning of the thing she was asking for. We had several more conversations across the following months. They were different from the previous 20 years' conversations in a way that I'm still learning to articulate. The difference was in who was bringing the weight. For 20 years, Ruth had been the person who received my weight, and I had not been receiving hers in equivalent proportion. And the conversations that followed her articulation of this were an attempt to reverse the flow, to be the container she had been, for what she had been carrying alongside the 20 years of being mine. What she had been carrying was more than I had known because I had not been asking in the way she had been asking me. I had been present for her in the ways that presence announces itself. The significant moments, the crises, the things that require a witness. I had not been present for the ordinary ongoing texture of her interior, in the way she had been present for mine. The difference between those two kinds of presence is the difference this story is actually about. And the 20 years it took me to understand it is the honest accounting of how long that kind of understanding can take when you are the person whose presence is being received rather than the one doing the receiving. The friendship is still the most significant relationship of my adult life. It is different now than it was in year 20, and the difference is in the direction of the flow, which is less consistently one way than it was, and more honestly mutual, in a way that required Ruth's articulation of the question. For me to understand, it had been there all along. The question the friendship had been asking me for 20 years was whether I was going to be for her what she was for me, and the 20-year answer was partial. And the 21st year is when I finally began giving the answer the question had been waiting for. And that is where we end tonight. Not with a resolution, with someone beginning to give an answer that was 20 years overdue, which is the most honest place any of these stories can end because it is the place where the work is still happening, rather than already done. Every story tonight was a story about the same thing. Not betrayal, though there was betrayal. Not conflict, though there was conflict. The same thing underneath all of it. The gap between how we understand the friendships we are in and what those friendships are actually containing, and the specific cost of the gap, and the specific value of closing it when closing it is possible, and holding it honestly when it is not. The people in tonight's stories tried. Most of them made mistakes, and some of those mistakes were significant, and none of them were, in the end, simply villains or simply victims. They were people in relationships that were asking things of them that they did not always understand, trying to give what the relationships required with the understanding they had available. And sometimes the understanding arrived late, and sometimes it arrived in the wrong form, and sometimes it arrived exactly when it was needed and made something possible that had not been possible before. If something tonight felt less like a story and more like a conversation you have been inside, if you recognize the gap, or the asymmetry, or the version of yourself circulating in a room you were not in, then you already understand the thing these stories are pointing at. You understand it the way you understand things that have cost you something, which is the most durable kind of understanding available. Take care of each other. It is harder than it looks, and more worth it than it sometimes feels. I will see you next time.